Assalamu alaikum everyone. Good afternoon. I hope you are all doing well. Welcome to our webinar on developing ESG landscape strategies for sustainable success, organized with the collaboration of CPD and NRC Committee of ICAP. In today's rapidly evolving corporate environment, understanding and implementing robust environmental, social, governance practices is more critical than ever. This webinar is designed to provide you with a deep dive into the principles, importance, and benefits of ESG. We will explore the latest developments in ESG frameworks, the processes for integrating ESG within an organization, and the key consideration of ESG reporting. We will begin our session with the recitation from the Holy Quran. Please remain silent and respectful during this time. Thank you.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان
Sadaqallahul Azim. Thank you for the beautiful recitation. Now, I would like to invite Ms. Amara Shamim Gondal to deliver the opening remarks. Ms. Amara is the first female elected member of the Northern Regional Committee of ICAP for the term 2022 to 26, former chairman of NRC and currently chairing the CPD Technical and Professional Affairs Committee of NRC ICAP. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Amara Gondal.
Thank you, Minahel, for the introduction. Respected Vice President Zishan, former Vice President and current Chair CPD, Asad Feroz, Chairman NRC, Secretary NRC, our esteemed participants and distinguished guests, Assalamu alaikum. And I warmly welcome you all to this very important workshop come webinar on ESG. And this is my privilege to have you all over here. And we are very much delighted to have Dr. Christopher today with us as our lead trainer. And there is, we know that he is the expert on the subject matter, and he has been instrumental in educating and implementing an advanced understanding of ESG principles across organizations, across different geographies of the world. So thank you so very much, Dr. Christopher, for joining us, and especially joining us today from South Africa. We had an opportunity to have him a week before in Pakistan, and we really wanted to have it as one full day workshop. But unfortunately, because of the various reasons, we could not hold it. And so we thought that we should grab this opportunity in any case, even if he's traveling back to South Africa. So we thought that why not to convert it into a webinar. And thankfully, with Asad Feroz, we conceived this idea, and we thought that we simply convert it into a webinar today. So on this subject, we have actually done a series of events and extensive workshops across Pakistan. We held it, last from the last 2 months. We have been holding various workshops and, in fact, master classes on sustainability in Lahore, in Islamabad, and SRC held it in Karachi. And now we are going to have a series of such webinars and small workshops to have a more grip on this subject, because this subject, what we see that over the course of the time, we have seen that ESG principles have never been more important than they are today. The recognition of the interconnectedness of environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and governance best practices have become a cornerstone of modern corporate strategy. Companies that embrace and adhere to sustainable and that contribute ESG standards not only contribute to a more sustainable and equitable world, but they also get benefit from significantly in terms of reputation, risk management, and long-term profitability. So its importance cannot be undermined. So this is very much pertinent that ICAP is playing its very much role, that we should equip our members with this important topic. Uh, every time that we have an opportunity of having great trainers and instructors to educate us more and more about this topic. So I would highly encourage all of you to engage actively throughout the webinar, raise questions, and share your thoughts, because this is an opportunity. This is a topic that is very much latest today, and a lot of developments and a lot of evolution is going on, and there is always a mutual learning process that is going on. We learn from each other and collectively explore the vast practices or potential of ESG principles and practices, and how we are going to implement it. That. So, without a further ado, I would like to hand over the mic to Minahel to take up the proceedings further. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Amara, for your insights. Our lead trainer for today is Dr. Christopher Whittle, an esteemed ESG expert. Dr. Whittle brings over 25 years of experience in sustainability and corporate responsibility, having advised numerous multinational corporations on integrating ESG principles into their business strategies. He has trained organizations across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, and serves on the elite consulting panel at the Institute of Risk Management, South Africa. Dr. Whittle holds a PhD in public governance and management and a Master of Business Leadership, making him a leading authority in ESG, corporate governance, and risk management. Please welcome Dr. Whittle.
Thank you very much. It's always a privilege, and it's a pity I didn't get an opportunity last week to meet most of you when I was in Karachi and Lahore. But certainly, I hope that there will be further opportunities to meet on a face-to-face basis. If you allow me, I'm just going to put up my screen, and I'd just like to make sure that that is in place. Sorry, I just want to get this properly reduced. I've been working on a bigger screen, so it makes it always a challenge when you wanted to do it on a smaller screen to make sure everybody can see me properly. And there we go. So let me zoom in, and I assume everybody can see my slide. Am I making the right correct? All right. All right. So with the introduction, it's very clear that you've been, dealing with ESG and had some previous engagements. And so what I've done is I've going to do a very brief an overview of probably some of the things that you've covered for those who might be new to this topic or haven't attended some of the others. And then my intention this afternoon is to focus on the areas I believe really provide challenges to people from a financial background, and particularly those of you who are members of ICAP. So intention is to do a little bit of covering the ground of what you probably have covered, but certainly then to move away from that and not to rehash things that you've dealt with. So just in broad, when we talk about ESG, just remember what we're talking about. And in this slide is a very useful slide because it provides us to say we've got three pillars, the E, the S, and the G, obviously. But we need to keep a couple of things in mind when we think about each one of these pillars, the E and the S particularly. And that is that the intention is that we not only look at the risk component when we consider, the factors of ESG, but that we also look at the opportunity component. So throughout corporate governance frameworks right now, you'll see that it talks about risk and opportunity, the new frameworks. But specifically, when we look also under IFRS, it's and S, the sustainability standard, there is a very large focus on being able to look at ESG from a opportunity as well as a risk component. And the one that we're probably most familiar with is obviously looking at climate change and the effect of carbon emissions on climate change, and a lot of discussion that's taking place regarding that at present. And it's one of the biggest challenges, because if you look at the new frameworks that are coming out, particularly IFRS, you'll see that the initial focus has always been on carbon emissions. But we must be very cautious to consider carbon emissions or climate change as being the only important area that we need to deal with under environment. And we need to understand the importance of looking at the other areas quite significantly. And that, for example, deals with the issue of specifically with the issue of water, biodiversity, and biodiversity has become an area of increasing importance. And the reason for the increasing importance of biodiversity is because of the impact on pollination, the impact or our dependency on animals, insects, and birds to pollinate and provide food. And 60% of our food is dependent on pollination. So if we look at that, the natural resources, then obviously pollution is an area that of great concern, whether it's electronic waste from all our computing equipment, but also obviously polluting of water supplies, polluting of land, making it unusable. The environmental opportunity, of course, is exciting. I do believe that when we start looking at green energy or energy that is more renewable, it does force us to rethink the way that we approach the use of energy and ensure that we're sustainable for the long term. Obviously, on the social pillar, we're looking quite strongly on human capital within the organization, of course. In other words, how do we deal with our people? But do not lose sight of the human capital in terms of our value chain. And we're starting to see a greater focus not only on how we treat our own people, but along the value chain. And when we talk about value chain, we mean up and downstream. In other words, the value of goods that are coming into our organization that we use and what goes out of our organization. And that value chain, if you are aware of what's happening in the European environment under European law, the Corporate Social Due Diligence Directive, the CSDDD, has been promulgated, and it's going to come in full effect within a year and a half from now. And it's going to require that European countries, for example, report on their value chain and the treatment of people, child labor, fair labor, and everything else. And these are things that we might, start to concern ourselves about, primarily because we also might be doing business with Europe or doing business with multinationals or listed companies that do business with Europe, and therefore we might need to be aware of our reporting requirements. That's supply chain labor standards under the human capital pillar. Other things that we need to think about, obviously, a greater focus on data privacy, quality of our products that we produce, and then the opportunity, and particularly because we're also looking at banking, and some of you would be from a banking environment, access to finance or access to for people to adequate healthcare opportunities to ensure that people are properly fed and have a quality of life. Overseeing all of this, and as much as we put the three pillars equally next to each other, essentially the governance pillar, is an umbrella pillar. And the reason for it is because we need to ensure that we are reporting properly, we're holding matters to account, we are behaving ethically, we are a good corporate citizen in the way that our organization operates. And so the governance pillar becomes critically important. And you see that the development or the importance of governance came through after the worldwide financial crash, concerns about the fact that businesses were behaving maybe legally, but certainly not ethically in terms of selling toxic loans, and providing funding, or selling of products that they knew were not substandard in many ways. If I move on then, and I start asking myself, given this that we mention is ESG, those pillars that I mentioned, the opportunities and the risks, is there then a difference between what we refer to as sustainability and ESG? And as much as ESG is all about sustainability, and we will refer to sustainability reporting. So ESG is sustainability. It's all about sustainability. But there is a different dimension when we talk about ESG, and that is the dimension of prescribed metrics, prescribed in many ways targets, prescribed format of reporting, prescribed matters of what we need to report. So where you're starting to see that sustainability as past practice really allowed organizations to apply a lot more discretion as to what they wanted to report on, and maybe hide or kind of obfuscate the areas that were uncomfortable. If we are doing some good in the corporate social responsibility, but we're doing a bit of pollution, then we would highlight what we're doing well at and kind of hide that portion that is the less attractive component of what we're doing. And suddenly we're faced by ESG, where we are prescribed to be able to report on these things, including our impact on waste, our impact on water, our impact on pollution, and maybe the things that are not so pretty about what we're doing. So we're moving away from a feel-good environment about going green or reducing our carbon footprint or making a difference in society, to much more data-specific, much more directed reporting, and more specifically as well, comparative reporting. So where we are based on the fact that we have to report along certain metrics, we'll be able to be compared with other organizations that would be within the same industry or different country and so forth. So remember the issue of climate change. And I mentioned that particularly under IFRS reporting, the sustainability, we have the second disclosure that focuses on the effect of climate change. And the question often is now, well, what do we talk about global warming, and what does that mean in terms of the areas? And the idea is to be able to go and say, well, what is the average temperature of the Earth's surface compared to pre-industrial levels, before we started burning fossil fuels to do manufacturing, run machines, equipment in the industrialization of the world. So what was the average temperature? And the question then is, why has this temperature risen over period? And ultimately, what is the impact of that? And I thought the best way to demonstrate the reason that there's a concern is maybe through providing you with an indication of the impact of that. So imagine, and many of you would be at an age where you might have very young children, or in fact, imagine that one of your children was born in 2020, just 4 years ago. Now, if you go and have a look at that pre-industrial area, in other words, let's talk about 1900, and on this scale, we're looking at 2100, in other words, only another 76 years from now, and we go and have a look and saying, okay, so what are the different scenarios? And remember, these are scenarios. In other words, what could the temperature look like in future? Now, if you go and have a look at, in this particular case, we've got emission scenarios of very low, low, intermediate, high, and very high, a typical 1 to 5 Likert scale. But if we go and have a look and say currently, or at 2020, it was around about 1.1 degrees warmer. The estimate now is probably closer to 1.3 degrees in terms of global temperature. Now, what would the impact be if we go forward? And you could see that if we do not address the issue of climate change or global warming, we could find that your child that was born in 2020, by the time that they are 70 years old, in other words, within your children's lifetime, they could be experiencing a world where the average temperature of the global temperature has risen to a level of 4 degrees. Now, I'm not a climate scientist, and I'm not going to claim to make all kinds of fancy modeling in that regard. But if the bad weather we've seen, or the unpredictable weather, change of season, the flooding we saw in Pakistan last year, different kind of weather, droughts in some areas, suddenly these changes, if they are related to global warming, as it is said it is, and at 1.3 degrees, we're already seeing massive impacts on people and quality of life and business. What would that be if we then go and we build it out to 4 degrees over a period of another 66 years from now? What would it look like in your children's lifetime? And you can imagine, if what we find now in weather is so unsettling, under what would that situation be under 4 degree, which is almost 4 times the impact of that. So let's go and have a look then at the issue of, excuse me, I've got a bit of a sore throat, so do forgive me. So if we go and have a look at what would 1.5 degrees, in other words, we're not even at 1.5 at the moment. We're close, but not at that point yet. But what would just a 0.5% increase make in terms of it? Because when we talk about 1.2, 1.3, and then talk about 4, it doesn't give us perspective. But when we start looking at, well, what does it mean just from a 1.5 to a 2% change in global temperature, then we could see that it could make a massive difference, just a 0.5% change. In other words, the number of the population that is exposed to severe heat would be 2.5 times more. Decline in fisheries, double. If you're going to have a look at the reduction in invertebrates in terms of biodiversity, doubling. And so we can go and have a look. Population exposed to flooding is almost doubled. So it gives us a perspective of why reporting under climate has become such an imperative worldwide. European standards under law, the ESRS, the European Sustainability Reporting Standard, but within the rest of the world, the adoption, as we're going through now, of IFRS, and particularly focusing on the second area. Of course, we said that it's E, S, and G. And as I said to you, I'm just going very, very briefly over everything because my intention is not to rehash which you've already done. But the area here, the focus here is under diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's what the DEI stands for, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And obviously, this is very different view of what diversity, equity, and inclusion is over the world. Some of it has to do with gender issues. Some of it has to do, with male and female representation in terms of it. There are, country to country and area to area differ in respect, but it doesn't change the fact that the need to look at these issues becomes important, and particularly the need to report on them where we are being forced to report in certain areas on diversity. So what do we mean? Well, why is this important? And I took out a recent article regarding child labor, for example, where we need to start asking ourselves under the social, are we busy with responsible supply chains or responsible value chains, where we're finding that, children are being used, being forced to do working and maybe not attending school simply because the bigger brands in this particular case, the perfume brands are making tremendous profits, but forcing the prices down to the people who actually got to do the picking of, in this case, jasmine, where people can't afford to employ others, but now need to use their children to survive, to be able to provide it. And so the question here is, on the one hand, we're talking about, social responsibility, but we also need to be aware that, down our supply chain, we might be taking the benefit of lower prices, but at the cost of the quality of life of others. And this is why, the social pillar becomes really important. And obviously, when we talk about diversity as well, we need to keep in mind that we're talking about, age diversity, board representation, male and female representation, and there's a need for it because we find that, if all board members are 55 plus, all are male, they all tend to think similarly because they grew up in the same time, but at the same time they also have the similar shortcomings, in terms of experience in social media, experience in IT and so forth. So when we have a more balanced board in male, female, age, knowledge, and everything else, experience, we tend to find that the research shows that it tends to be better decision making in the organization. When it comes to the governance side and what governance is, once again, I'm going to keep it really brief because I know that many of you have gone through this in much more detail. But I thought I'll just use the World Economic Forum to say, what does it constitute or what does it refer to when it talks about the issue of governance. And the starting point of governance will always be an effective board that behaves ethically. In other words, the organization behaves in the manner that is right and fair in terms of its operations. I spoke about board composition in the way that we put it together. But there are other areas that we specifically, very strong. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has a big focus on corruption or anti-corruptive practices, anti-collusion practices, and you can go and look at the documentation available, as well as an organization that we pay our fair share of tax. And then we have this fair value chain management I mentioned earlier. So these are some of the areas. And once again, I'm just touching on to remind you of the area that, you've already dealt with. So let's go look quickly at the ESG frameworks. And once again, I'm going to be a light touch across this. And it's important that you need to be familiarize yourself with these frameworks. And the reason why is that most of these frameworks are the foundational frameworks that then have been drawn into IFRS and constitute the main guidance on what we should be reporting and how we report. So the first of these is the SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals. You will remember that 193 countries in 2015 signed up to achieving certain targets across these 17 SDGs by 2030. Essentially, to improve the quality of life across, for everybody living on the planet Earth. And each one of these, of these 17, um, is important. And this was a year 2015, of course, when also we had the Paris Accord. Later in the year, if I remember correctly, was December, when countries also adopted to say, what targets are we going to set in terms of remaining or trying to keep the global warming below a 1.5 degree phase, and we're setting what we refer to as nationally determined contributions, NDCs. Now, the SDGs are important. And for you reporting as business, you might say, yes, this is a governmental adoption. But remember, government can't achieve these SDGs on its own. It will enforce, certain policies down on society and down on business and economy to be able to meet its commitments if it is serious about achieving these particular commitments. So across all of them, whether we're going to have a look at the need to have better education, decent work in terms of, salaries, labor structure, the way we treat people, fairness of employment, disciplinary, and everything else. But then also getting to the E component, where we start looking at, climate action, life underwater, life on Earth, really important areas. So the SDGs are important. I'm going to show you later when we look at the reporting challenges. I want to show you the linkage between how we link the SDGs with some of the other frameworks that we need to report on. So I hope that you go and read the SDGs, and that within your own reporting, you consider to say, as an organization, how do we contribute, or how do we then impact on SDGs, and how do we bring this into our reporting as an organization? The other standard that you need to, or standards that you need to be familiar with, obviously, are ISO standards, the International Standardization Organization. Go and have a look at them. I just put up a couple of here just for you to be aware of things that you need to keep in mind. That the ISO, particularly in terms of the reporting, is very, very important from us to keep in mind in terms of environmental management systems, looking at greenhouse gas reporting and verification of our reporting, as well as then quality management. So do not neglect the importance of ISO as a standard in your reporting. It's also important to keep ISO in mind with when you are reporting greenhouse gases or emissions, that the organization who does the verification or assurance work for you would need to have the right ISO certifications to be able to undertake that. And that's typically, if you don't look at the ISO 64, 66, 67 kind of series, and that's why you'll see it says ISO 14064 series of standards. The first major standard I quickly want to touch on again, and as I say, I'm aware that most of you have dealt with this, but once again, as I say, a light touch is the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative. Now, the Global Reporting Initiative has been around for more than 25 years. It has developed over the time. But its significance, or is because of the wide adoption worldwide and the recognition of the quality of the disclosures that take place under GRI is important. So when we look at GRI, it is certainly a framework that you should consider to apply. Now, remember, the GRI is a voluntary framework. I've very seldom seen that organizations are compelled to report under GRI. there are a few African countries that I've done consulting work with, where the central bank, for example, has required companies and banks, of course, to report under GRI standards. Now, when we look at GRI, remember the GRI views the impact of the organization. In other words, how does the organization, I would like to say, from an inside out view, how does the organization impact on the economy, on society, on the environment? When we would want to be able to measure or to identify those things. Now, the important part to remember as well is that the GRI has a modular approach. It is comprised of three different broader standards when we look at that. And I myself am a certified GRI sustainability professional. For those of you who really want to improve your knowledge on the ESG side, it's one of the qualifications I recommend, particularly when you're looking at impact materiality. We'll be looking at the impact of the organization on its environment, economy, society, and so forth. Now, very briefly, remember that GRI provides you with quite a lot of guidance as to how to apply it. GRI 1 really gives you the principles to say, when you're looking at implementing GRI, you've got to remember comparability, the ability to verify the data, accuracy, and all these principles apply. And so, familiarize yourself with the principles before you jump into the GRI. GRI 2 really then summarizes the information about the organization itself, its structure, its industry, and everything else. So it's more of a disclosure about the organization. GRI 3 is a very useful guidance, and it helps you to determine that which is material. In other words, how do we determine what we should be reporting on? So the concept of materiality is defined or is linked to the concept of significance. Excuse me. So the significance is, what would the readers of our report consider significant or important for them to understand? In other words, our impact on those factors I mentioned, the environment, the economy, and society. But the process of how to do it is really guidance is provided under GRI 3. So what GRI says is, first of all, yes, the principles, yes, the guidance, and this is the information about you. But now let's go and do, and remember, those of you come out of a risk management environment, we establish the context. In other words, what kind of business are we, and what kind of industry do we find ourselves? And it might be that because we are in oil and gas, whether we are in agriculture, aquaculture, whether we're in mining, and a number of industries, GRI is saying because these industries are so significant in terms of their impact, that if your organization falls within that industry, there is already a standard that has been developed for that industry. These are the things based on the typical identifiers of that industry that you should be reporting on. And these are the typical topics based on the fact that you are in this particular industry that you should be reporting on. Now, it could be that some of those particular topics in that industry that's been identified are not relevant, but it is a generalization. So we would normally first look, if we want to apply GRI, to say, does our organization fit into one of the predetermined sectors, yes or no? If we've gone through that materiality process, and I'm going to talk more about materiality a bit later, then we would say, okay, so what topic standards then, if we're not in the sector, what topics are relevant to us? So if I look at GRI 14, which is a new standard, you can see the standard was published in 2024. And if you go and look at right at the bottom, it has an effective date. And if you look at the effective date, it is 1 January 2026. So it is important that when you look at GRI, that you look at the latest standard, but also at the same time, when is its new effective date? In some cases, there are transition from the older standard to a new standard. So just be aware of those particular issues. And within this, the standard, if you're in a sector and the standard, it would say, given that you are in argument's sake mining, and I use mining as an example, here are some topics that would be material to you. Energy use, emissions, for example, because it's the nature of the business that you would have, a big impact on using high levels of electricity or power, also in terms of emissions, because water pollution with heavy metals in mining and everything else. So ready to say, if you're in this particular industry, very typically these are the topics that you should be reporting on in terms of the area. If you are not in a sector that is recognized, already determined, then you would go and look under topic standards for the things that you've identified as being material, and you would go and look at each one of them and say, for example, that water or the pollution of water, the use of water is a material issue in your business. Then you would need to report, amongst others, under GRI 303, water and effluents, and this purely as an example. Now, just remember, as I'm trying to wrap up on the GRI side, that when you use GRI requires certain things that you need to keep in mind. The first thing that you've got to remember is that you need to apply the principles. In other words, what I mentioned earlier: comparability, verifiable data, accuracy, full transparency, and so on. Then you go and understand the context, which I mentioned. Are you in a particular sector, yes or no? Then you need to identify where are those areas that are significant impacts you have on the economy, environment, and society. You would have to assess that significance. And when you start using these terms, those of you who are familiar with enterprise risk management would really understand, but we're doing the same process here. We would have contextualization, we would have identification of risks and impacts in this particular case. Then we would need to evaluate how severe those, and we might use a 1 to 5 rating scales to be able to assess it. And then we identify those that are most highest priority. And I will talk later about how, potentially how we develop a cutoff. In other words, where do we cut off to say these are material and these are not as material? We would then go and say, these are the material topics we've identified. Now, under our standards, sector standard or topic standard, we need to go then report under each one of those. But what are some of the things that you also need to keep in mind? Number one, GRI says if you use the GRI standard to report and develop a report on your impact materiality, you need to provide a GRI content index. In other words, where do we find this information in your reporting? Now, not all the information needs to be in a report. It might be that that information is available in another report, or alternatively just on your website. And so you'll be in this content index to say, this is the topic and this is where you can find it. Either page this and this within my report, or go to website, go and look at this place, and this is where you'll find it. The second component that you need to keep in mind is that you need to publish when you report under GRI, and I often see it missing in many organizations, is a statement of use. And the statement of use is, am I reporting in accordance with GRI, or am I reporting with reference to GRI? And those two things are very different from each other. When I say this is a report is in with reference to or in reference to GRI, it means we haven't applied all the topics that might be material. It is more selective because we might not have all the information. So the reader immediately knows when there's reference to, that it's incomplete. When we say it's in accordance with, we are making a statement that in fact the user can take this as being fully material and a full disclosure of our materiality. Lastly, when we use the GRI standard for reporting, GRI requires you to notify them that this is what you're doing, so that anybody that goes into a sector reports under GRI could go there and do some comparative assessment between your report and someone else in the same industry. All right, so as I said, a very light touch, just touching on what I believe are some of the core issues that you need to be aware of. I think then I'd like to just quickly talk about greenhouse gas. And once again, I'm going to do a very light touch because I believe most of you have gone through this in relative detail. So just remember, when we talk about greenhouse gases, we are actually talking about 7 different greenhouse gases. And the whole idea is that we need to, carbon dioxide is really our reference gas or reference for emission, and the rest we will convert into what we refer to as carbon dioxide equivalent. So we will say, for example, amount of methane emissions that we have, how do we convert that with a conversion factor to be able to come to equivalent of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So you'll see when we're reporting, we don't report across all of these, unless, of course, you want to, but you'll be reporting on CO2e, the carbon dioxide equivalent in your reporting. So when we start looking at carbon dioxide reporting or the greenhouse gas across all 7 gases, the first thing that we've got to keep in mind is organizational boundaries. Typically, we would be reporting greenhouse gas at a corporate level, or I would say at a group level, if you're a group of companies. So then we would have to go and determine, but where are the boundaries that are included in our organization? And this becomes important, particularly when we go and look at issues of ownership, if that's where we're going to be focused on reporting, or on issues of control, which we will discuss in a second. So organizational boundaries become very important. The second thing is, as I said, is the operational boundaries. In other words, which of our companies are going to be included in our reporting, but also which of our operations are going to be specifically included. And it becomes important when we consider that we might be in a joint venture arrangement with an organization, or we might, own a business, but someone else is actually running the operation for us, or does the controls. So the question is, where do we cut off in terms of our reporting? Now, when it comes to consolidating these emissions, because I'm talking about on a group level or in an organizational level perspective, we have a number of approaches that we can take to reporting our greenhouse gas. The one that is most looked at is typically the control approach, because the equity is very simple. If I own I don't have any joint ventures, or I don't share control of my organization with anybody else, I own everything, then the equity share is quite simple. But as soon as we have this kind of shared arrangement where we have joint ventures, or we have different equity levels within organizations, typically we want to look at a control approach rather than a consolidated approach, because we need to find, or put it this way, when we report, we need to report consistently. We can't, on the one hand, report on equity share, in another area on control approach. We need to use the same approach throughout the organization. Now, the financial control environment, if that is the basis on which, in other words, where we exercise control of the budgeting and the financial management of the organization, and a factory that we have financial control over is producing 800 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year, then we need to report for the full amount, even if we only have 10%, 30%, or whatever, a smaller equity, if we are reporting across the financial control. So it's very important to determine what is the approach we're going to take. If, for example, we're reporting on a financial control, but we've got this joint venture, but in fact, our joint venture partner or our equity partner who actually exercises the budget control of the budgeting and the finance, then they would have to account for the full value of the emissions, and we would account for nothing if we apply the financial control approach. However, in practice, we find that the operational control approach is most widely used. And that is simply who has the right to push the button, who runs the operations. And the same principle applied. If irrespective of the equity held in our organizational boundaries, if we are reporting, and most organizations agree to report on operational control, then it depends on who is control. And it might be that we agree with our partner that we have 50% control, and therefore we would take 50. So it depends on the extent of the operational control in our reporting. Now, when it comes to reporting, and I'm going to very briefly, as I said, touch on this, we need to distinguish between the scope 1, 2, and 3. And what does scope 1 mean? It is the emissions that we directly generate through our operations. Scope 2 is the bought energy. So whether we're buying steam, heating, or power from the power utility in Pakistan, then the emissions that was created by that organization, the power station, to provide us with electricity, pro rata, we need to then consider or bring into calculation scope 2. So scope 2 only deals with the emissions created by when we purchase electricity, steam, heating, or whatever the case may be. Scope 3 is a bit more complicated. And the challenge for most organizations is going to be to report across scope 3, where we've got 8 upstream and 7 downstream potential reporting areas. You'll see that on top of this diagram, we've got these 7 greenhouse gases. Scope 1 is those emissions caused by us directly. Like what? Our company vehicles. When we control whether they drive around or not. And for every kilometer or every liter of fuel they use, whatever measure we have, a certain amount of emissions are created while they're on the road. So we can directly influence that. Our company facility is the same. We might have standby generators. If the power supply fails, we start up the generator. It burns either petroleum or dieseline, and it then obviously generates power. That's also under our direct control. Scope 2, we said, is the power we purchase, typically from electricity provider. And then scope 3 has a number of areas that we would think about across our value chain. The easier ones, normally when you want to start your process of going down the route of reporting on scope 3, is to start with business travel, to calculate, how many kilometers we are driven for business travel. At the same time, also flights that are involved because of obviously emissions through flights. The second area is employee commuting. So we'll be able to find out once a year, maybe from a survey, how far our employees live from the office, and we'll be able to calculate, on average, how many kilometers are driven every day, every month for the year, and we'll be able to do that. So those are typically the 2 easiest places to start. The rest become a lot more complicated. When it's waste generating operations, we need to measure it. When it comes to transportation, we've got to determine what is material, and we might need to then spend quite a bit of time with our suppliers to be able to calculate transportation and distribution costs, upstream and downstream. And this is where that CSDD I spoke about earlier, the corporates reporting and the reporting to Europe is going to become more important, because as Europe in particular have legislated reporting, 30 to 50,000 companies are going to be reporting on this financial year across all of this scope 1, 2, and 3. And they might need, if you're doing business with them, to get your data because they're going to say, we need to incorporate it in our figures. And so even if we have a slower adoption of IFRS S in Pakistan and in South Africa, already, some of our organizations are under pressure to start collecting data and reporting because of who they do business with. So I am busy guiding a manufacturing entity here in South Africa that manufactures refrigeration for cold drinks and um, for Coca-Cola and multinationals, and already this company is under pressure to provide figures for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, uh, data regarding its staff behavior, labor practices, whereas within the regulatory framework, it might still be another 5 years before it gets there. So doing business is much more of a pressure than just the regulatory environment. So remember, collecting data is really important, and it's not an easy. And my recommendation to anybody who's implementing it is start early, as soon as possible. Because first of all, to be able to find the right data in terms of kilometers driven or number of liters of fuel bought or the number of kilowatt hours used is not always that simple. It's spread typically across an organization. So how do we find that? How do we centralize that data? And then how do we apply an emission factor? So for example, if it's per kilometer driven or kilowatt hour used, or a liter of fuel burnt in the generation, we need to then go and get an emission factor for each one of those activities to calculate the extent of the emission. Now remember, the tons of emission here might be across all 7 of the greenhouse gases. So we might then need to go and convert those calculations, other than of course carbon dioxide, because it's one, through a global warming potential ratings to get a carbon dioxide equivalent, that's CO2e I spoke about. That's what we need to report on. So we need to go through this process of estimating or calculating emissions. Some of it, 6 of the greenhouse gases, need to be converted. The other will remain the same. All right, so I'm going to skip this as I use the example of electricity use, kilowatt hours, distance traveled, amount of liters fuel used. And that greenhouse gas is that conversion process. And I just use an example here. You'll see, for example, methane or fossil-based methane in a 20-year period, when you're converting it, that greenhouse gas or global warming potential is 83 times that of carbon dioxide. And you can go and look at, for example, tetrafluoromethane, 5,000 times more, and nitrogen trifluoride, 12,800. So the conversion factors in terms of that become really important. All right, so moving off the greenhouse gases and the GRI, one of the areas that I want you to go and have a look at is the CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project. That's what CDP stands for. Now, the Climate Disclosure Project established the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and it's set up. It has a questionnaire that are completed every year by organizations that have subscribed to it. What it provides is saying, when you go onto the web and say, do you want to become a reporter or disclosure under the CDP, you will then select what type of organization. Are you in the public sector space? Are you a large corporate? Or are you in fact a smaller organization? And then based on that, what industry you are and what are the areas that you want to disclose on. So there's a process of selectivity when you're going to CDP. What is good about the CDP is that when you get to the actual questionnaire that is relevant to you, each question has a certain amount of guidance linked to it. And that guidance, in other words, how you compete. Now, the question might be, why would you go through the CDP? And the reason for it is that when you go and look at IFRS um, S1 and 2, particularly IFRS S1, it refers you back to the CDP for certain guidance on biodiversity, on water, and so forth. So it provides, says you go back under CDP for guidance in certain areas. Now, what the CDP does is once you've completed it, it goes and scores your level of ESG awareness. And it would say that, you know, you could be, if you're top rated, and I think last year there were 300 out of the about 26,000 companies that reported, about 300 got an A in terms of leadership, in terms of ESG leadership. But you can go and now compare in the industry, where do you lie and where are the areas for improvement. So it's in a way, I would almost say a very good way to get a free ESG rating for your organization. Some of the rating agencies, you know, are very expensive in terms of rating, but through the CDP process, you can actually get a very well recognized and internationally recognized rating, and that will form a baseline for you to compare, you know, with the annual improvement activities. Now, as I said, the important part of CDP is its mapping to IFRS, and I just used the example of CDP questions and map to IFRS S2, and you'll say, for example, the question, CDP question 2.1, how does your organization define short, medium, and long term in terms of the management of environmental dependencies? And then if you're going to have a look at the mapping under IFRS S2, the paragraph you can look at is S2 paragraph 10, the supplement 2, for example, S2. So there's a very strong linkage between CDP and IFRS. And remember that CDP has been absorbed into IFRS. It is no longer a standalone organization. It still has its own website. It still forms the basis of many of IFRS processes and questions, but in fact, it is now a member of the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. Maybe just for a quick stop here, and I'm going to see if I can try and, are we going to have the session at the end? Okay, Manuel, let's do that. That might be easier. So I'll keep with that arrangement. So let me go back then to the previous section, and that is on TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Now, the Financial Sustainability Board established the TCFD several years ago, and ensuring, and once again, one must go and just think about the name of this particular thing. It was Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. So we understand where the focus is. Number one, it's on climate, and number two, it's about finance. And so the whole reason why the Financial Services Board created or established the TCFD was that the users of financial statements, and particularly looking at investors, banks, and insurance underwriters, would be able to get a better sense of the risk they are dealing with in the organization in terms of future climate-related risks and opportunities, of course, but primarily risks. So that was a very clear purpose of the TCFD. Now, once again, the TCFD does no longer exist in its own right. It has completed its responsibility. 95% of what the TCFD said has been incorporated under IFRS S2. And it is now being monitored by ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is under IFRS. So the TCFD in its own right has ceased to exist. But I'd need to go through the principles and the understanding of it to really improve your understanding going forward, that you have a better grasp of where does IFRS S2 come from and why, is this an important area. So you'll see that when we look into the future and climate related risk, remember risk is forward looking. It is looking into the future, short, medium and long term, and saying what changes in climate, what would the impact be on two areas. Number one, our move as an organization from a high carbon environment where we use fossil fuels and carbon to a move to a more renewable energy, low carbon environment. What risks are associated with that move? The second area, what is the impact of climate change on the assets of the organization? Because of the fact that we realize that some of the lending, remember, if we're looking at it from a bank perspective, or we're looking at an investor perspective or insurance perspective, surely they want to know when to be able to price a risk properly. We need to be able to have a better grasp of what those risks are and what assets are going to be at risk. So in this period where we are now as an organization, and where we might want to be in 5 years or 10 years in terms of, our transition from a high carbon usage, fossil fuel burning environment to one that is, low fossil fuel, more renewable energy. There is a transition period in which there are increased risks. And the increased risks are, number one, that we select the wrong technology. I remember the first time I put solar, or not solar, but battery system and an inverter in my home. It was still the big gel batteries that you got, and very old technology, because that was the only thing that was on the market at the time. But with the greater move to renewables, we've seen this explosion in the solar, amongst other solar energy field. And your problem that you have is you might be investing as an organization heavily in a technology that is known today, but that in a few years' time can be seen as completely archaic and no longer fit for purpose. So there's a risk in this transition that we are investing in technology that is known today, but also understanding that there is a tremendous amount of research and development taking place in renewables that could make our current investment redundant, or our technology redundant in a few years' time. So there's a risk associated with it. The second risk, of course, is policy risk. In other words, government suddenly coming to you and saying is we're adding a much larger carbon tax. Certain activities are no longer allowed. We're not going to allow it, or we're going to restrict certain things. So that could be a problem. So in this period of time, with governments to meet their nationally determined contribution under the SDGs that we spoke about earlier, the Sustainable Development Goals, suddenly they're starting to put in change of legislation, or a new government comes in much more green-minded, and you find yourself, that some of your operations just can't operate because they can't meet the cutoff. They can't meet the emission levels, the cap on emissions, for example. The other area is litigation, of course. We're finding that much greater litigation in terms of pollution, in terms of behavior, in terms of product quality. So during this time, we could find that we are facing greater levels of litigation. And then, of course, reputation. As an organization, that we don't want to be seen as damaging the environment, treating people poorly, poor quality products. And then the market risk deals with a change of demand, change of the nature of the product. I remember very, as I traveled, using plastic bottles to buy water. And now when I go through to some of the airports, I in fact use this refillable bottle because filling water is for free, filtered water, but you need to have your own container. So market risk. People are becoming much more aware of, plastic and the impact of plastic as an example. So some of our products might no longer be acceptable. On the other side is the physical risk side. And the physical risk, we're talking about two types of physical risk. One is acute, where something happens almost as a once-off, or suddenly we have an extreme a weather event. In South Africa, we had a hurricane come through the tip of the KwaZulu-Natal coast, which is where Durban is, and that came through and caused a tremendous amount of damage 2 months ago. And I'm late 50s already, and it was the first time I've ever heard of anything of that nature in the South Africa taking place. So it was a unique event, acute physical risk. It happened. It caused a massive amount of damage and destruction, but it wasn't something we've seen before. However, in the same area, in the KwaZulu-Natal, over the last 2-3 years, we've seen a shift where every year there's much more rainfall than there used to be. In some areas where I live, and maybe more north in South Africa, the rainfall is reduced a lot. So areas become drier, not very good from a farming perspective. Yet in a certain other area, suddenly there's a lot more flooding and a lot more different problems. And that chronic means a longer term shift in pattern and climate patterns. And this has got major impact. If you are a farmer and you're producing a certain product because of ideal climatic conditions where you have your land, but as we see a change, it could be that you no longer can produce or produce a certain product, mangoes or whatever the case may be, because the weather's become either too wet or too dry or too cold or too hot or whatever the case may be. So I thought I'd use a practical example. And this was in a newspaper article earlier this week. A home that was in Nantucket in the US that was assessed just a few months ago. The home alone was assessed at $1.9 million, but yet the property was sold for $200,000 simply because of rising sea levels. So the property got wrecked by recent storms, but more than that, it's a simply change in sea levels has substantially reduced the value of the asset. And let me show you an example. So yeah, in 1998, if you see the rectangle, the green rectangle, that is where the property was, and on the top piece over here, you can see the little house in the top right-hand corner of the property, and you see where the ocean is, and in fact you see the beach of that particular area. If you look at 10 years later, suddenly the property that was right, close to the beach is pretty much on the beach. This property on the right-hand side, and you can see how much of that sea level has moved or the encroached in a period of 10 years. Then in 2018, the house that was there before has completely gone. It's completely been engulfed by water, and you can really see to what extent the sea and the beach has moved up onto that property that marked by green. In 2021, you can see it's also even moved a little bit further in the space of just 3 years. Then in terms of 2024, now you can see that and where the property is, and you can see here on the picture on the right-hand side, this is the property that's now being sold for a fraction of the initial price, because it is expected that within a period of a few years, that property is going to be completely engulfed by the sea and no longer exist. So when we see and talk about physical assets, changing the damage to physical assets, we need to understand that in some cases, assets like our collateral, if we are bankers, or the physical assets we own, could be reduced in their value. And I thought that this hopefully will also help you to understand how some of assets are become less valuable and more at risk. And if you were the insurer and you've been insuring this particular property, within 5 years, this property might be completely underwater or washed away. And as insurer, you would have substantial losses in that particular case. So when we look at this chronic and acute, do not see that purely only as, in terms of temperature. When we talk about climate, we often want to talk about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or whatever the case may be. But we also need to say, okay, yes, so how do we break temperature down in its taxonomy and break it down into its different categories? So, yes, we've got changing temperature, but that could be that variability in temperature, or, greater levels of frost or cold, which could damage plants or production. Wind, of course, which I discussed earlier about in Durban area, and then water-rated damage. Whether water becomes more salination of water, or acidification of the ocean, or water that we have. Water might not be usable anymore. It might be there, but it's just not drinkable. But also we've got the damage of the soil. So we can start looking at climate change and break down what we call a taxonomy, break down the different categories of what is understood under chronic and what is understood under acute. I thought I'd just use an example, which is agricultural based, which might be, given, a lot of agriculture in Pakistan as well, which would once again, you can go and have a look and say, what is those transition risks? Increasing carbon price, what does that mean? It means a lot of the input costs into farming would increase, because whether you're using greater level of fuel, greater level of vehicles, maybe some of the fertilizer groups. So we're starting to see that transition risk is much higher input pricing, rising reputational risk in certain areas. Physical risk, of course, we've discussed, could be sea level rise, which I just shared an example with you. The fundamental important slide, if I can call it that way, under TCFD, and it's important that you understand this slide, because IFRS S2, by implication, expects you to understand this, but doesn't provide you with the background to it. So you need to understand this and then go and apply this under IFRS S2. Because we've just spoken about these transition risks. We've just spoken about the physical risk, the acute and chronic. If I go and look on the other side of the equation, I see the opportunities. Opportunities, for example, a new market, opportunities to become more resilient through the mix of power, and how we get that through. So we also see the opportunity of becoming more energy efficient, for example. But these risks and opportunities don't just hang around. They need to be fundamentally incorporated in our strategic planning. So when we do our strategic planning, we should be doing a risk assessment to say, what is the climatic changes that we're expecting in the short, medium, long term? How severe are those? Let's rate them. And now we need to bring them into consideration at strategic planning. So where can we take opportunities of new markets? Where can we look at new efficiencies? But at the same time, how do we mitigate some of the risks? How do we mitigate some of the danger that we face? Given that, we are going to then do new strategic planning. Now, the new strategic planning might require some major investment in certain new areas. It might mean that some of our assets are going to become devalued because of the kind of expected future damage, or they might become redundant, or whatever the case may be. So we understand that what is happening climatically impacts on my financial position, on my cash flow, because I might have reduced revenues in certain areas. I might need to completely massive investments, my capital and financing in certain areas. Impact on my balance sheet, impacting on my income statement because of losses in certain areas. So this financial impact is where TCFD, under the financial disclosure, in other words, disclosing what is these future, or what do we believe the future financial impact of climate will be on the organization from a financial perspective. I'm going to skip that for now, and I'm going to leave that for Danish to talk a bit about things. But the important part with, and second important part with TCFD, it says when you report on these matters, you need to report on them across 4 pillars: a governance pillar, a strategy pillar, a risk management pillar, and a metrics and targets pillar. Governance, how are we going to, and I would like to call this the reporting onion, if I may, because we need to open it. And that structure of governance, strategy, risk, and metrics and targets becomes important because it provides us with a structure on which we need to report. We're going to report about the board's oversight, and we're going to report about management's role in terms of ensuring that we manage the risk and take the opportunity from a climatic perspective. At the same time, we need to report on how we bring in those climate-related risks and opportunities into our strategic planning over the short, medium, and long term. We need to discuss, what is our processes within the organization to exercise risk management and to report on it and to measure and to mitigate. And then comes the important component also, which is the very strong on the ESG, which I said the separation between ESG and sustainability, and that TCFD said you need to disclose your scope 1, 2, and if appropriate, 3. And you'll remember I said that TCFD makes up about 95% of IFRS S2. And part of that 5% is because here, for example, it says, if appropriate, report scope 3. Under IFRS, you're not given that choice. You've got to report scope 1, 2, and 3. So that's one of the changes, for example, that IFRS has brought through in the process. Another framework that you need to be aware of, and I want to say, go and have a thorough look, is the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. Now, I said earlier that IFRS S1 refers you to CDP for guidance, but you need to remember that IFRS S1 and 2 were published in June last year and came into effect 1st of January this year. The TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, was only published in September last year. So it was published post the publication of IFRS. But the important part, it provides you with a much better framework that is in alignment with IFRS reporting under S1, that is got the same approach. So I believe it is the better framework for you to consider when it comes to nature and biodiversity reporting. So go and have a look at TNFD. And I've just used some examples here. It has fantastic guidance documents. You'll see that, for example, the very first one on the left-hand side, the guidance on value chains in terms of nature, was only published last month, June 2024. But there's a lot of guidance also how to do a scenario analysis within the nature environment, not only just on climate. So this is on a nature focus. So please go and look at TNFD. It has fantastic resources free of charge, but the important part that it links with it. Now, TNFD follows a typical risk management approach. They just call it something else. They call it a LEAP approach. And the LEAP approach is standard, I want to say, ISO 31000 risk management approach on how to evaluate it. In other words, locate your interface with nature. That is the establishing the context in risk management. Then, to evaluate your dependencies. In other words, is identification of where the risk and opportunities lie, assessing them in terms of the severity of that, and then obviously P, the preparatory respond, is typically mitigating treatment options if you look at it from a risk perspective. So it's nothing new. It's just different language. Nice little acronym or LEAP, but it is the approach is a very much a proper risk management approach of applying it. Now, this is why I said, look at the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. The reason for it, you'll see it follows the same structure as TCFD: governance, strategy, risk, metrics, and targets. And doing that, when we later report, and I want to spend a bit of time on reporting considerations, that we then make sure that when we report on this, we're using the same pillars: governance, strategy, risk, and metrics. And it just makes a much better fit than some of the CDP. As much as you can use CDP if that's your preference, I recommend that you look at TNFD because of the fit and the similarity of structures. As an example, some of the metrics that might be quality of water, and it's simple. You can go and have a look at the TNFD. Guys, I'm close to wrapping up the foundational issues. I'm bringing some important stuff, hopefully, is SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, known as SASB. You will see on the right-hand side, I put the logo, now part of IFRS Foundation. It has also been assumed into the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is the IFRS Foundation committee responsible for managing sustainability reporting. Now, what SASB does, it provides, in terms of this onion, here I am again at this onion component, it provides you with some metrics and targets at the reporting side to say, what are some of the things that you should be reporting on, and how do we measure these things that you need to report on? And so SASB already, so when we look at materiality later, we already know that if we are, SASB has established some of these metrics for 77 industries. So go and have a look at the SASB website and go and see what's available. For example, and here I have an example on the left-hand side, you'll see that it says SASB standards for commercial banks. So if you're a bank, you'll be able to go into financial institutions and you'll see that there are a number of standards for banks, for example, commercial banks, investment banking, consumer finance, mortgage lending, and so on. And each one of them you'll see on the right-hand side will say, what is the major topic, and then what is the metrics on which you should be reporting. So if you're a commercial bank, there are already some of the things that you should be reporting on that SASB has already identified for you. So in a way, it fulfills a certain similarity of what GRI sector standard did under impact assessment, whereas under financial impact, we now looking, or financial materiality, SASB provides also a sector basis. I said they've got 77 different industries mapped. So what has happened? We've seen this move from all these many different frameworks, plenty of them, a consolidation. And I'm only looking at non-US, non-European environment, which you fall into. And you can see that the CDSB, the CDP established the CDSB, but has been consolidated into ISSB. TCFD has been consolidated. SASB has been consolidated. Integrated Reporting Framework been consolidated. Now, it doesn't mean that any of these things that have been consolidated are less significant. It just simply means they are assumed in your reporting under ISSB, under the IFRS S1 and 2, that you already are familiar with these particular frameworks, because ISSB in the IFRS 1 and 2 assumes that you will already have this background and would report in accordance with those particular frameworks. So, the International Sustainability Standards Board, where does it fit in? Well, remember, it fits in essentially over here on the top. It is the board that was established to ensure the quality of sustainability reporting at the same level as the board that ensures the quality of financial reporting, accounting reporting. It was established, and you see that we've got these two standards, IFRS S1 and 2, S standing for sustainability, and they came in effect 1st of January. Now, just what they look like, you can go and download them for free. Of course, you'll see that it's got sustainability disclosure standard number 1, really deals with, I want to say, general disclosure. In other words, the impact of, and now we're looking, with GRI, we looked from the inside out. We looked at the organization's impact on society, environment, economy. Now we're swinging it back in IFRS 1, and we're saying, what is the effect of the economy, environment, and society over the short, medium, long term on the financial information? And that's why you talk about disclosure of sustainability related financial information. What is the impact on my balance sheet, my income statement, cash flows, and so forth? S2, we spoke about already, is the climate-related disclosures. And I said to you, it's a 95% fit with TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Now, this onion I spoke about under TCFD, it has been brought under ISSB, and it is the same approach of reporting: governance, strategy, risk, and metrics and targets. And that is why I said, look at this, because when it comes to nature-related issues, the TNFD uses this exact same structure in terms of reporting. When you want to look at your reporting under IFRS S1, it refers you back to CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. But remember what I indicated earlier. This was published prior to the establishment of TNFD. So therefore, use TNFD as your primary source of documentation. You see it also refers here to the SASB standards. If you are in this industry, like I showed you example of banking, then you should go and look at there for metrics and targets of your reporting. So some general issues on S1 and 2. You need to publish the report on your sustainability report at the same time you publish your financial statements. And you need to make an unreserved statement to say you have complied with the reporting requirements if you're reporting under IFRS S1 and 2. Where you've had to make certain judgments, or you had to make certain best approximations or assumptions that you made because you might not have had the data, and also you're doing planning for looking forward, then you need to indicate where you've made those assumptions, and particularly where you are concerned that some of those assumptions might be good, are very uncertain. Okay. Then the last point I wanted to show you is part of what the requirement is cross-referencing. And that cross-referencing really is the fundamental principles that are in the integrated reporting framework that was incorporated into this. So the whole concept of cross-referencing, and also like GRI with the content index and cross-referencing to the web and cross-referencing, is important for the reader. So I could see how these things link to each other in my reporting. Obviously, S2, you'll see it's TCFD again. Climate-related physical risk, climate-related transition risk. I'm not going to go through it again. I believe you've done this in the past and in quite a bit of detail. So having caught up on all of the stuff that you've done before, I hope, is that I want to just focus, as I said, on one or two areas that I believe really I see in my consulting work on ESG that pick up problems along the way. And the first one is the concept of materiality. And for you who are accountants or come out of the accounting profession, you want to be careful that you don't perceive a materiality from the same way that you would calculate materiality when you do financial reporting. It's not the same concept, and we need to use a different approach in this regard. So when we look at materiality, remember that we are now looking at the reporting from the perspective of the general users of your financial statements. And I said the general users of your financial statements would be investors, lenders, insurers, maybe even the regulators and so on. So when they look at it and they say by either omitting, in other words, leaving it out, by misstating it, in other words, by falsifying it or obscuring it, hiding it under some other verbiage, if by doing so, you would, and the word comes here very strongly, reasonably, under the reasonably expectation that if you, by not doing it or disclosing it properly, that you've actually misdirected or influenced the decisions of those categories of investor, banker, insurer, regulator, whatever, then it is material. It is significant. Now, what are the factors that you got to go and look at that we're saying is on what are the material areas that focus? And the focus is on the business model. If you know my business model is at risk because the change of what I'm doing, if it's an issue of my ability to generate revenue, my financial position, my capital, and so forth. So you can see the value drivers that we've got to think of. GRI has a similar, now remember that was looking at from a financier or external investors perspective in the organization. GRI is looking outside and it says that same thing, reasonably, if what impact we would have on economic, environmental, social impact, and that stakeholders in terms of doing business with us would be impacted by it. So I spoke about the general users, those who are buying your equity, those who giving you loan or credit, or those who potentially going to take decisions in terms of providing you with insurance products or whatever the case may be. Now SASB, those 77 industries I spoke about, already has done some materiality mapping. It says, for example, and I'm using what's in red here as an example, you can see if you're in the extractives and mineral processing broader industries, then you can see it goes from coal mining, iron steel producer, metals and mining, oil and exploration, whatever the case may be. Then what already is determined as material to the reader, the user, is what's in this dark gray area. Greenhouse gas emissions, air quality, energy management, water and waste management are things that you should be reporting. And you could go to look at those to say, okay, what are the specific metrics I need to be reporting on? The lighter gray are the areas that are most likely that you might need to report on. And so SASB has done some mapping which you might find useful for you in terms of your materiality assessment process. Now, as I spoke about impact materiality, and then I spoke also about financial materiality. So the one is where we're looking from outside in terms of the impact of climate, environment, society, the economy on your financial position, your business model, your finances. That's what we refer to as financial materiality. The other one is impact materiality, is looking from the inside out, our impact on environment, society, economy, and so forth. When we look at these two types of materiality together and we report on them together, the inside out and the outside in, then we refer to it as double materiality reporting, is when we look at it from both sides. And my recommendation would be that as organizations, I strongly suggest if you are going to start reporting or already have reporting, consider double materiality approach. And the reason is quite simple. The IFRS, the ISSB, on behalf of the ISRS Foundation, has come into agreement with the European Union that there will be future interoperability between the two standards. And already, right from the start, the European reporting approach is double materiality approach, where IFRS at this stage is only on financial materiality. So there's no doubt that it's going to still develop further disclosures. It's got S1 and S2. It's going to have S3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a whole number of additional disclosure documents. Because if you look at Europe, it already has, if I remember correctly, 12 disclosure requirements. So it is much more expanded in terms of its initial reporting requirements. So going through this materiality approach, I recommend a number of things that you need to do. And my concern is, the reason why I wanted to spend some time on materiality is that it's garbage in, garbage out. I've seen organizations reporting, in terms of their reporting and saying that they identified materiality, but they didn't go through a thorough process of materiality assessment to really determine what are those material issues or items or material matters that we should be reporting on in our annual reporting. So I recommend a four-step approach, if I could put it that way. We need to, identify our business activities. In other words, we need to establish our context. Where are we, and what is the value chain up and downstream that we work with? What are the risks upstream and downstream in terms of our operations? Then we need to go and saying is, how do we then assess or evaluate those risks to be able to make the cut off what is material and what is not? And then obviously we need to then be able to plan in our strategy how we're going to adopt a plan to be able to deal with it in future. And I'll talk more about that in a short while, but also in terms of reporting. So I'm aware of time. I think I only have another, how long do I have? Another half an hour or another 3/4 an hour, I think. So very, very briefly, you need to go and have a look at this, and you'll get the slides. I think ICAP will provide you with the slides, but you need to go and have a look about what are those things that are already maybe in the news, things that we already are required from a regulatory framework perspective. What are those things that we've peer reports or sector benchmarking or analyst reports, publications that are specific relevant to our industry to say farming in this area is going to be heavily affected by whatever. So let's first go and identify what are those areas of risk and opportunity in our value chain. So once we've got a sense of who are our stakeholders, what are the potential areas, we now need to engage stakeholders. And this is an area that most organizations are pretty rubbish at, and that is to really interact with stakeholders, to get a sense of feedback, to say, these are the main areas that we've identified in our value chain, and we believe are areas. Do you agree that these are in fact significant areas? And it might be that you put together a survey monkey, put together a survey, and you put down a list of different items that you've identified as potential risk items, and that you get your stakeholders to rank them on a 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 scale to say, how important do they consider this area to be in terms of what is material from your perspective. Not only are you getting from your research, as well as what is regulatory environment, as well as what stakeholders view, but also go and have a look at those sustainability items that are already prescribed. In other words, GRI, as I said, if you're in a sector, they've already got prescribed areas that should be reporting on. Under SASB, if you're in a certain sector, it already has certain prescribed areas. So surely those things that are prescribed should be material. So I've done my own research. I've looked at my supply chain. I'm confirming things with my stakeholders. But at the same time, I need to look at what is prescribed, what already is indicated as being material. I want to say now we've got maybe a very long list of maybes, could be's, whatever the case may be. And that's typical in risk management. When we've gone and identified a whole bunch of risks, we've now got a list of risks, but now we need to go and rate those risks. And we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions to refine our list and reduce it, because we want to focus on that which is really material. And we might want to say, look, is this matter regulated? Is it already disclosed a requirement? Maybe through central bank in Pakistan, maybe through, one of the other entities says you already got to report. The ministry already requires you to report in certain areas in terms of your emissions. So there's already an indication of significance. Now, is there already a GRI or SASB standard that covers that particular area that says this is significant? Well, then pretty much that's a good idea. We can also go and look at previous material assessments and the starting point. So I've been doing the materiality assessment for the airports company of South Africa for 2 years. And I could go and review with a workshop that I did with stakeholders, but also with internal stakeholders in the air traffic navigation services as to what was significant last year and has anything changed from that year to this year, and compare it. But I had a starting point because I'd done the materiality assessment last year, for example. And then, if we're in an industry where there are peers or, even foreign peers, are there certain areas that I should consider? And then also you can go and have a look at your value chain dependencies. Now, here becomes important areas because it's not only in terms of value chain, but think about the TNFD area as well. Your touch with nature, your touch with biodiversity, your touch with suppliers. It is, and that is why I said go and look at it, because it follows the same governance strategy, risk, metrics and targets approach. And immediately we can go and see, are there areas where we are dependent on others, where we are impacting on others, where we are certain resources we require. Once we've done that, now we need to assess it. And as I said, this is a risk management process, right? We need to then say, what is the potential impacts? And then how significant are those impacts? And when we talk about significance, we talk about material. Are they material? Are they going to have a major impact on the financial effects of the organization, short, medium, and long term? Is it going to have an impact on our financial position, our cash flows, our access to finance, our cost of capital in future, the quality of our balance sheet, and so forth? So we need to assess then also, even though we understand that GRI is an impact materiality and IFRS was focused on financial materiality, in effect, they affect each other. Because if I'm not treating customers fairly, which would be a very much a GRI kind of environment, treating customers fairly, then I'm going to lose customers, and therefore that's going to have a financial impact. So we've got to understand that as why double materiality is so important, because some of my actions from a impact materiality perspective are going to have impact and be material from a financial perspective. So understand the interlinkages between this. Guys, so I just thought I'd put a couple of questions for you to think about. So when you are thinking about these things, if we have this climatic change, for example, and I'm looking at short, medium, long term, is it going to result in changes in my operational processes, my planning? If the answer is yes, then I need to start thinking, what's the financial impact of that? Because it might mean that I need to invest heavily in new technology. I'm going to lose some of my operations that are no longer feasible or got too high levels of emissions that will, not be allowed with the new and not be feasible with new carbon tax environment. So we need to be able to look through these kind of questions. And I'm not going to go through all of them with you. I really want you just to be able to go through this again when you're on your own to think about it. I think also when you start assessing the level of those risks. So when we said we've got this long list of potential risks, I need to think about the impact across a number of factors on my operations, on my clients, on my vendors, everything else. And now I need to rate it. And you'll see that there are a number of things we need to think about. Number one is, how big is this impact? The scale of it. How broad is it? Is it are we looking at it as a high, moderate, or low kind of environment? To what extent can we remediate or reverse damage? So if you're in an area where oil spillage or pollution in land can easily be changed, or no, the impact is really significant, well, then surely that must be a higher level of materiality. And then likelihood, if something is unlikely to happen or very likely to happen, it also brings in that other risk component. And the magnitude is the financial impact. To what extent is it going to be able to now, when we look at magnitude, we would already have in our risk management matrix, or our risk matrix, a heat map, or whatever you like to call it, we would already have an indication to say likelihood and consequence or impact, and where does this lie? And if it's very high on financial impact, very high on likelihood, then already we're starting to see massive red flags in terms of materiality, being material. Once we've gone through this process of rating it in terms of 1 to 5 or whatever scale you might have, relevance to the organization and relevance to, or important to stakeholders, we then can go and plot it. And we can go and plot it on what we refer to as a materiality matrix. And you'll see that in this case, a Booz Allen or consulting firm, they've gone and put 4 quadrants in. You do not have to do that. What you could go and look at in my risk management framework, anything that is, argument's sake, on a 1 to 5 scale, and a 1 to 5 scale, anything that is more than 4 out of 5 from likelihood and 4 out of 5 out of impact, in other words, 16 out of 25 and higher, might be things that we consider material and therefore need to report on. So make sure that your materiality determination is linked fully with your risk management decision-making framework in the organization that you apply, because IFRS says that it needs to be, you need to disclose how these are interrelated with each other. You can't, the risk, climate risk is just one of a number of risks. So you need the same processes and the same procedures. And then once you've gone through this thing to identify those that are material, you now need to say, okay, so what do we need to do about it? In other words, and we might also need to confirm again with stakeholders, these are actually the material issues. Are we sure? Are we happy this is the case? And if this is the case, then we need to be able to report on it. I think that was the first thing I wanted to discuss with you, was materiality. And it's a concern I have, because I see that in reporting, it's one of the areas that is really leading to very poor reporting, poor planning, and so forth. The second area, and briefly I'm going to touch on, as I said, I'm aware of time, is that IFRS 2 says to you, you need to do three things, really, if I can summarize it. The first one is you have to do climate scenario analysis. If you are in a more advanced firm, like a bank or insurance company, where you can do, modeling, then you can, apply it. If you're in a smaller firm, you can do a more qualitative approach. But applying, you need to look at climate scenario analysis. And the reason for it is you got to get two things that come out of that. The one is you need to determine the organization's climate resilience, how well we are positioned not only to survive, but to thrive, given the expected changes in the climate, and particularly when it comes to climate, the consequence of higher emissions or higher carbon dioxide or equivalent emissions, and the impact of that. So how resilient are we as an organization? We need to disclose that. The second one is we need to develop a plan. If we are now in a high emission environment and we're moving to this emission, and given our risk and exposure to the higher climate environment or changes, how do we plan, as part of our strategy, a proper plan for the future that will help us to adapt and adopt, measures that will enable us to be much more resilient in future. So what IFRS does is says you need to make sure, to what extent, based on your model, how resilient this organization is, and then obviously what you're going to do to adapt or to adjust to it. Now, if you can read S1, S1 says the general disclosure requirement under ISSB, it says you need to disclose if you used so if you use scenario analysis to see what the effect of the environment, society, and economy would be on short, medium, and long term. But S1 is not an obligation. When it comes to S2, it says you need to disclose how and when you undertook scenario analysis. It is not optional. It is not like S1, which is an optional activity. S2 pretty much says not only must you do it, but you need to disclose when you did it. So how relevant is your analysis in still? Now remember, the point of the scenario analysis is to challenge your business as usual assumptions. It is to develop what we refer to as plausible future outcomes or pathways. In other words, what could, under certain assumptions, could potentially the future look like in the short, medium, and long term. When we look at TCFD, TCFD recommended that you look at in your scenario planning on climate change, that you bring in at least a 2% global warming environment into your planning. In other words, we are now at 1.3, argument's sake, 1.2, 1.3, it depends on who you listen to. Minimally, you need to say, in my scenario analysis, on 2%, what would the impact be on water, on temperature, on availability across my value chain? How would that likely to impact me? What would the situation be under 2% world? But we also need to look, argument's sake, at a 1.5% world, because remember, under the Paris Accord, governments have committed themselves to try by 2050 to make sure we keep the global warming under 1.5%. So that's a different scenario. So when we look at scenario analysis, it not only says, okay, so what are the potential risks under different scenarios, different adoptions of technology, different adoption of the speed by which the NDC, the nationally determined contribution of Pakistan, is implemented by the government, policy changes, everything that goes with it. But at the same time, what are the potential opportunities that will come through? Because within the next few years, we expect substantial improvement in the quality of ability to generate renewable energy. So we want to understand the business, how it's going to operate under different future states, that resilience. I've already spoke about the plausible states. We want to look and saying, what is the physical and transition risks that would be applicable, but at the same time, the opportunities. Go back to the TCFD diagram that I shared with you earlier this afternoon. Now, before we undertake the scenario analysis, remember that there needs to be proper governance in place, that we have a proper process in which we look at scenario analysis, we have a proper oversight by the board or the board committee responsible for it, and that we then bring the materiality of climate risks, which I've discussed in the under materiality, that we now bring it in here and saying, okay, so what are those things that are going to be material for us, because we've identified it, and under transition and physical risks. And then we need to use a range of different variables when we're looking at our scenario. For example, what do we expect the gross domestic product to be in the next few years? How do we see economic growth in Pakistan? What do we see demographically and societal changes? When I was, a lot of young people who are qualified are leaving the country for better. So how does that impact us on availability of good people going forward? What is the assumptions we're making regarding, carbon tax or other changes in legislation regarding pollution and energy mix and everything else? So we've got to be able to go and have a look and saying, okay, so short, medium, and long term, what are different scenarios and how would the organization fare? In other words, how resilient it would be under each one of those scenarios. And so we're going to take these different potential scenarios, this range of scenarios, because we would look at different temperatures, we look at different scenarios, and we'll evaluate the resilience of your organization and your stress strategy. And it might be to say that this strategy is not plausible given the kind of environment we expect. We need to make substantial adjustments to our strategy as well as our business planning, including our financial resourcing. Now, guys, when you want to look at strategic or scenario analysis, and I'm referring specifically to climate scenario, go and look at the International Energy Agency, the IEA, the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, or the International Panel for Climate Change. So all of these provide a certain level. I'm a big fan of the NGFS, and I'll share some of it with you in a moment, because it's freely available. They've already done a whole lot, and your question is, you need to go and say, does this make sense for us? Can I bring it back to applying it to myself? Now, remember, any kind of, out of these big scenarios that have been done, IEA, NGFS, IPCC, you've got to remember this is a worldwide view. Now you've got to go and say, is it relevant to my industry? What do I specifically need to make adjustments, tailor make it, that is to make it more relevant for my geographical location or the nature of my value chain, the nature of my particular assets, my stakeholders, and so forth. So we need to tailor that for that purpose. Now, for good guidance on how to go about applying scenario analysis, IFRS doesn't provide you with it, but TCFD provided you with a really good process to say, we've gone and looked at that materiality. I did that earlier with you, how we look at material issues. Then we go and look at our range of scenarios. We look at what is the impact of those different scenarios. For example, on my operating costs, my revenue, my supply chain, or my value chain, my business interruption, and things like that. And then what are the potential responses I need to make in my strategy and in my business planning? Do I need to change my product mix because there's a changing demand in the society and so on? So then I document it. So this TCFD, applying the scenario analysis, go and read the TCFD guidance, which is not provided under IFRS in terms of that. In essence, we are going to make a number of choices. We're going to look at the parameters. In other words, and I just use simple parameters here, just one parameter, for example, energy demand and mix. So what is the assumption we're making on that? On my analytical choices, we've got physical risk, transition risk, but just here on physical risk, what is the impact on that? And then what is the impact on these on my earnings, my assets, my revenues, and so on? So go and have a look at the TCFD guidance to provide you with better direction. So some of the common climate scenario storylines, for example, you will see that I've just used 4 major storylines over here. Paris ambition, in other words, Paris ambition internationally to keep global warming under 1.5%. Delayed reaction, the TCFD recommendation. In other words, governments are not going to meet their targets. They're going to be a bit slow on the uptake. So therefore, we need to see a 2% world. Things are going a bit slow. Then when you look at current national commitments, then we've got a bit of a crisis, guys, because we're seeing that, if you look at what governments have promised to do and where they are actually in terms of executing these problems, then minimally, I think we're lying at a 3 to 4% increase in global temperature by 2100. And then if we continue as business usual, in other words, quite frankly, nobody really does much. It's all a lot of hot air and talking, excuse that pun on the hot air. And then we are going to probably go closer to 4%. So now already here are 4 different scenarios for you. And what is the social impact? And you would obviously need to go and look at each one of these in more detail. So if I look at the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, you can see it has taken different potential scenarios and say, what could be the outcome? If we have business as usual, by 2100, we could be closer to 5 degrees global warming. But if, for example, we do have, meeting the 2050 target of keeping it under 1.5. In fact, actually, you'll see that it goes blue. We actually bring it down even to lower than maybe even existing levels where we are now. But what I recommended to you was go and look at the network for greening the financial system. Yes, it says financial system, but it, the models actually apply to almost any organization. It'll at least give you some guidance on what to think about. And you'll see that they've plotted the risks of climate across the transition risk, which we've discussed, as well as the physical risk, and created different scenarios. A disorderly scenario. Within that disorderly scenario, for example, delayed transition, in other words, it's taking organizations later. Divergent net zero means that some countries or some areas are becoming net zero, but others are not at all. It's this very disorganized, where we have a very orderly one, so the risk is low, transition and thing. But in reality, where we're probably looking at is a hothouse environment where, or too little, too late, where, people are just not doing much. Now, what the NGFS does on their website, and you can go and have a look, they provide you with a description of what each one of these scenarios means, like orderly, and within that, what hothouse means. And you'll see that NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are not being met, and current policies, of course, is a problem, because the current policies are not enough, to help us achieve what we need to do. So it has different scenarios. You can go and look at them. What it does provide is to say, if we go and have a look at a net zero by 2050, everybody meets their promises in line with the Paris Accord. What would this picture look like? And you'll see that the policy ambition is to keep it at 1.4 degrees, part of the Paris Accord. The policy reaction would be that, in my assumption, or our assumption would be, that it would be immediate. That would be required to be able to keep it under 1.4. That would be a fast change in technology to make provisions like carbon removal. You'll see the medium use of carbon removal technology, medium use of that, but we see not too much variation. And so each one of these policies and situations, current policy ambition would be to try and keep it at just at 3 degrees, low use of carbon reduction technology, slow use of renewable energy or reduction, and so with the risk that go with it. So you could have scenarios as much as very positive, where, in 2050 we've achieved not only net zero, we've managed to improve the temperature, I think, or ultimately the worst case scenario, or even more than 3 degrees, is where we failed. And those would be the kind of scenarios you would need to go and look at resilience, and also the inputs to start thinking about your planning for short, medium, and long term. So let's talk a bit about some of that planning. And I've got a little bit of time left to do the planning side. So when we talk about this planning, now we've got scenarios, we've gone and done our materiality. We said, what are the areas? What are the scenarios, materiality? Now we need to say, well, how are we going to respond to this? How are we going to mitigate the situation? How are we going to improve climate resilience? And how are we going to ensure sustainability of the organization? What mechanisms do we need to, from a organizational governance perspective, put in place to make sure we're managing and exercise oversight? And then, what opportunities are there that we can also take advantage of? Smarter workforce, using of artificial intelligence, improved supply chains, and so forth. So it's not only negative, but also positive. Now, once again, go and look at the TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force. And I just wanted to give you an example of some of the guidance that is available to you free of charge on the web. It was it was really excellent guidance. So you'll see, for example, the latest document that was published was the transition planning cycle in April 2024. But in other words, how to disclose, how to plan this transition plan, and then how to disclose it. And then there are also sectoral guidance. If you're in the food and beverage, if you're in banking, mining, and whatever the case may be, there are some sectoral guidance available to you. I couldn't put all of them up. I just wanted to give you some idea of what is available on the website to you. So go look at the TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force. Its work has also now been adopted by ISSB. So going forward. So what it does, it says, here's the framework for which you can go and do your planning. Number one is you need to go and set the ambition. What is it that we want to achieve? Action is what are we going to do? And accountability is how we're going to measure it and correct it, if I can put it in very broad terms. Now you'll see, for example, it provides you with guidance, and once again, you can go through it. Now, it has a plan principles, which I've very quickly discussed with you. My beginning point is you need to agree with the board as a starting point. Here are opportunities that we saw, or climate risk and opportunities we've identified in the previous pros. Here are material issues. What is it that we're going to agree is where we're going to go as an organization? And it's important that the board understands the baseline, where you are, that you can agree in terms of where you should be going as an organization and how the board is going to exercise governance over that. And it's important that, one of the things that IFRS S1 and S2 said is the board needs to disclose its knowledge, experience, and ability to exercise oversight. So the question is, what kind of knowledge and experience and oversight and skills do we need in the board? And I gave you some guidance at the bottom. You can look at Accounting for Sustainability, A4S, that's what it stands for, Accounting for Sustainability, has some excellent, particularly for financial managers like yourself, excellent free tools. You can go and look at how do you engage the board. Chapter 0 also has a board toolkit, the World Economic Forum, as a guidance. So go and have a look at the guidance I've included for you to help you in this area. So what do we need to do? We now need to go back to mapping our stakeholders in our planning to say, we've looked at it earlier. We don't have to do it again if we've done it in terms of our materiality. But now we need to engage them to say, look, this is where we think we're going. This is in terms of our strategy. Are you in agreement? Where are the areas we need to focus on? Then as that baseline assessment, which comes out of your materiality, but also you might need to look a bit further, go and have a look at the TNFD, that LEAP approach I mentioned earlier, and then also look within the organization in your transition planning. What do you already have? Where are the areas within your organization that are maybe ready for decarbonization, that transition from a high carbon to a low carbon environment? Then you need to set the ambition. Where do you want to go as an organization? Now, you can go look at the greenhouse gas reduction targets. You can look at the Science-Based Target Initiative. It's SBTI has a how-to guide, how to do this. It's free also, once again, on the web. So go and look at the SBTI, this Science-Based Target Initiative. It actually provides you with guidance documents on how you're going to go about setting the ambition. You can also look at the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. It provides you with some guidance on how to do or plan for decarbonization. And then you need to develop the action plan. So we've said we've got what's happening climate, where are we issued, where are we from a risk perspective, what is our stakeholders, what are the things. Now we go about our planning, we develop an action plan. You can go and look at, designing a strategic roadmap, and you can go and look at some guidance in the Glasgow finance documentation as well. Guys, and then you need to look at how you're going to, in this plan, ensure accountability. And once again, I've tried to give you some guidance. You can go and look at the climate-related forum guide on advice. On the assurance side, you can go and look at ISCA 3410, which is specifically focused on greenhouse gas reporting. And then in September, we're expecting a new assurance standard to come out. It's already been through the processes. We expect that ISSA, the International Sustainability Standard for Assurance 5000, is going to probably include a very large portion of ISA 3410 in it. And how we exercise oversight, in particular in terms of limited and reasonable assurance engagements. So when we talk about a reasonable assurance, is that when we want to be able to just get, a pretty thorough, and it's almost at the level of an audit, a full audit on the information that's being reported in our planning. Limited, obviously, there has to be more caveats or limitations in our reporting. When it comes to our reporting, please be aware of greenwashing. And greenwashing, as you know, is where we try to put a positive spin or falsely represent, what we do in our planning or what our achievements have been. And, you can look at some examples about that have been in the news, very bad from a reputational perspective. Companies like Volkswagen, which was found to have false advertising on its diesel engines, and Starbucks, where it claimed that its cups or paper cups were recyclable, when in fact, because of the plastic lining, it ended up on the landfill anyway. For you, in terms of your reporting, please also be aware of the development of the green taxonomy. Now, Europe has already got the European EU green taxonomy. In South Africa, we've got a green taxonomy, and probably in Pakistan, if you haven't got it already, you will have it. And that is that you're going to need to typically look at your objective setting in this transition planning, that what you're planning meets the environmental objectives under the green taxonomy. In other words, that we are doing climate change mitigation activities in our planning, adaptation, climate change, but at the same time, we must be aware that we can't hurt one of the other areas. So if we want to achieve some of the objectives, one or two or all of them, we need to be sure that we, that in our planning, this transition planning, that we also keep in mind the do no significant harm principle. That as much as we're aiming to achieve one of the objectives, we cannot then negatively impact some of the objectives. So I can't, for example, destroy biodiversity ecosystems in my attempt to improve my transition to a circular economy. One mustn't damage the other. So if we go back to the TCFD or IFRS governance strategy, risk management metrics, in my transition planning, I now can go and say, under my governance, how the board exercises oversight, my strategy component, what is the implementation and my engagement strategy, and then my metrics and targets in this particular process. Very quickly, I've got one or two slides and then I'm done, ladies and gentlemen, but I just wanted to wrap up with a final thought. And my concern when I look at a lot of reporting on ESG is that it looks like a dumping ground for facts and figures, and very incoherent. As a reader of the integrated reports or the sustainability reports, it really looks like you don't know, and I'm saying not you, I mean the writer didn't know what to do with this stuff, didn't know how to integrate this stuff, and so it's just literally a dumping ground. So understand that the International Integrated Reporting Council was drawn into ISSB, and so the principles haven't gone away. That we need, the principles of integrated thinking, in other words, that the organization is an integral part of society, integral part of the economy, integral part of the environment, but at the same time, the need and interaction with stakeholders. So the integrated model, if those of you should be familiar with it, it says we not only look at finance as an input into my business, and then the end of the year only reporting on finance, but I essentially need to understand that I need to report across 6 capitals: financial capital, manufactured capital, intellectual capital, human capital, social, and nature. And if I look at the concept of ESG, then I've got to understand that environment will be my natural capital. My S is my social and relationship capital. That will deal with, society, the community, my clients, my staff, my relationship with my peers, relationship with the regulator, and so on. Human capital, of course, the people and the skills that we have, intellectual capital, IP, and everything else that goes with it, manufacturing, computers, business, equipment, buildings, and finance. So we've got these capitals that come in as an input into our business. Overseeing this, we've got governance, which I've discussed with you, the G, the S, the governance, strategy, risk, and metrics and targets. And so that governance says, what are the risks and opportunities? We've discussed that quite a bit this afternoon. And the strategy, how are we going to mitigate, how are we going to create mitigation, and how it'll impact on my business model. So depending on the risks we see across my 6 capitals, it's going to impact on my business model, my business activity, and then the performance at the bottom, my financial performance. Ultimately, the end of the period, I want to create value. Did we create value through the implementation of my 6 capitals? But I want you to understand that when we look at my reporting, that IFRS has said, okay, here's my core content for IFRS: governance, strategy, risk management, targets. And we've discussed that because that was the core of TCFD, the TNFD, everything's there. But if you look to the right on the top, governance model, my strategy, my resources, my performance, those are all elements of the integrated integrated reporting framework. And so what IFRS has done is it's gone and plotted this for you to say, if I deal with these areas in my integrated reporting framework, in other words, if I go and look at this and I take these aspects and now I report it, this is how it fits together. This is how it logically slots in together. The same you can see here, for example, under S2, how does this fit together? Where does it fit under GSR, the risk and metrics and targets? Now, why is this important? Because now if I'm using my integrated thinking model as the framework or the basis for my reporting, now I can start building and saying, well, yeah, IFRS S1 and 2 fits into this. I've just shown you the linkages under the 2 slides before this. But not only that, if I'm reporting on my SDGs, under finance, I can see which of the SDGs are financially related, which are manufactured capital related. Now, I can also link it so that once again, it's logical. If I look under GRI, you can once again go and see, but which of my GRI topics link under what SDGs. And so when I'm reporting on my SDGs, it forms part of a logical. Now I've got a logical framework to hang my reporting on. I'm going to go and say, for example, under that SDG, here is my particular target: net emissions of my own operations by 2040, my supply chain by 2050. And so now I'm reporting in line with integrated framework, but I've managed to bring in logically IFRS 1 and 2 under my SDGs, my UN Global Compact, because I can bring my UN Global Compact linkages to the SDGs, all of it in one area. So I think that's what I wanted to discuss with you, and I think my time is up, which would give us hopefully time to discuss.
So I guess moving toward Mr. Danish Norani, who is here with us. Mr. Danish is an executive director of Redwood Global Services and engineer. Mr. Noorani is a seasoned management professional with over 20 years of experience in project management, compliance, risk management, and training and development. Mr. Noorani's extensive experience and practical approach to ESG implementation will provide invaluable insights. So please welcome Mr. Noorani with us.
Thank you, Manal. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And indeed, a very insightful presentation from Dr. Christopher. And this is a surprise for me that there are no queries on an ESG session, but generally there are many. Nonetheless, there are two I would say reasons to not having questions. और ये बहुत अरसे पहले मुझे किसी जगह मैसेज पे मिला था एंड वो दो रीज़न ये हैं कि या तो जो कुछ जो है वो प्रेजेंटर ने कहा वो सब कुछ समझ में आ गया है या बिल्कुल कुछ समझ में नहीं आया and the beauty of having you in a session and you can ask any question is that the presenter will have to answer anyway. I've been dealing with PhD session for quite some time now, but honestly, as this topic is pretty new and lots of development has been happening over the years in this arena, and still many guidelines are coming in, many standards are being revised. Still, this topic is pretty new, and always it seems that you're still a student and probably in this area, and ESG would be an area where we all would be a student for a longer period of time. And I'll begin with a story which I would say that happened to me last year when I was having a session on ESG in Saudi Arabia, and I was conducting a workshop. It was a full day workshop on ESG, and we were almost an hour and a half into the session, and one of the participants was listening to me pretty keenly, sitting on the right hand side of the corner, and suddenly he raised his hands up. So I gave him the opportunity to talk, and he suddenly said that, you know what, this all ESG topic and discussion, this is all an agenda of the developed countries to milk more from us. And it really took me on a surprise in a workshop with such a comment which I wasn't expecting on that particular day. But since then, I've been pretty keen to evaluate the response of the my participants and every individual who's interested in ESG topics. Whether is this a hoax or is it really something which we are experiencing, at least with respect to the climate change and all. Last week, when I had an opportunity to share a session with Christopher in a conference, and we asked the same question over there. Do you think is this a hoax or is this really something that is happening? And again, to the surprise of all our panelists, 55% of the audience says yes, they do believe that it's a hoax and something an agenda of the developed countries. And another 15% was saying that maybe they were not sure, maybe it is or maybe it is not. So it was approximately 70% of the population we were dealing with were really unsure about the ESG impact. So whatever, if it is an hoax or it is not an hoax, it is here, and being a financial professional, we have to, it's there, and we probably would be dealing with how to implement these standards and how to do the ESG reporting. But I'll take a step back. And I would rather see that how generally why the reporting standard or financial reporting standards are changed. And if we see for all those people who are a bit more experienced and here, they would agree that the financial reporting standards 30 years ago, 3 decades ago, were quite different from what we are experiencing or we are implementing the financial reporting standards today. And if I may ask a question, what is the driving force and what is the impact which compels the the ISP or the finance professionals to look into the financial reporting standards and adapt or change those financial reporting standards? The primary the primary answer that would come would be the business, the drive of the business scenarios. As and when the business scenario changes, the reporting requirements changes. For people familiar with the older revenue recognition standard, knows for sure that the primary principle was risk and reward, and not the performance obligation, what we do right these days. Similarly, IFRS 16, the spirit of the new IFRS 16 the leases was the dry leases in the aircraft industry. An asset type in one industry compared the entire financial professionals to change the way we record leases and how we account for leases. So this is how the business drives the accounting reporting standards, and how the financial reporting standards are then generally are changed and have an impact on our lives. So then the primary question arises: was there a need of sustainability related disclosure standards anyways? Because as Christopher, it was there have been quite some time that people are working on climate change and sustainability and ESG pillars of the ESG. As you said, GRI is a 25-year-old organization. They're working since last 2 decades or more. So why did the IASB or ISSB thought that this should be a part of the the reporting standards, and we as financial professionals should be something who would be driving these sustainability disclosures and all those things today. So honestly, what have been the driving force of our reporting standards up till now was the industrialization and the capitalism that was the driving force of the businesses and economies and all our GDPs. And we were growing in this industrial revolution phase, and all our reporting standards were there to make more and more our business reportings more and more transparent for the users of the financial statements, the investors, and the other stakeholders. So in the era of the industrialization, we were exploiting the human and resources of the mother nature, and all those exploitations were enabling us to be more and more fast in our industrial growth and in our development research. So yeah. So what we did that we were busy exploiting the human resources and the natural resources out there in the world, and we were not focusing on that. Maybe the mother nature would gonna react differently and not in a way we are expecting the mother nature to react, and hence we are now experiencing new risks and new dimension of our world, whereby we are seeing the lack of natural resources, or we are now predicting the natural resources to be exhausted, or the impact of those exploitation of natural resources on our climate and on the nature. So we always reported on, if I say, for example, of an oil industry, oil and gas industry, we always reported on the exploration and production and refinement and distribution and sale of oil and gas products. But we never accounted for the actual cost of the nature. What does that oil gas cost? what the Mother Nature has done several years or centuries to make those natural resources, but we never accounted for on our balance sheet. Something which is not accounted for in our balance sheet would not have any impact on our financial reports. Now the scenarios have been changed. So we never reported on, if I say of an agriculture side, we never reported on the strength of the soil. Yeah, we probably might have recorded land, but the valuation of the land was never dependent on the strength of the soil. And the same way, as the climate-related changes are occurring, more and more the business are now starting to feel that their business models or their going concerns of theirs or their future is dependent now, or at least have a significant impact on these climatic changes going on. For example, 2 years ago there was 6 weeks of heat wave in Europe, and River Rhine, one of the largest river, went down. The water level went down approximately by 80% in some areas. And River Rhine is basically also used for supply chain, for moving of goods from one place to another. So the entire supply chain was disrupted for more than 6-8 weeks or so. So the entire businesses had to address their challenges of supply chain and shortage of materials and all those things. So just the heat wave can approximately change. Similarly, in our country, we had floods a couple of years ago. And I remember I was consulting for certain textile industries, and they were really worried about how the cotton crop was going to react after this flood, and what would the impact would be on their business, because will they be able to get the required cotton crop for building of the yarns and garments and all those things. So impact is there. I remember one of the CEOs of the largest insurance company saying that world, which is 4% higher, with a temperature of 4% higher, which also Christopher also mentioned, would be absolutely non-livable or non-insurable. And something we all know, insurance is a very critical part of our businesses. So all these things which are now changing, compelled the financial professionals to change the outlook of their reporting, the way we've been reporting. So what's have been different? Let's quickly just touch upon what is different by IFRS S1 and S2 coming out. What's new, and other than what the topic? I mean, what's new in terms of our reporting mindset with respect to these sustainability standards and as compared to our regular financial reporting standards? First, which thing that they made they given a thought is that all those ESG issues, that technical terms that we are not aware of and we are not used to, they have translated those issues into a language which the accounting professionals or finance professionals are able to understand. And this would give us a more comprehensive or understanding of the issues of business issues, and enable us to digest the information out there and the impact of those on our business into our performance. We did a survey, and there was also a question in the conference last week which asked to the internal auditors whether they fear that the data gathering for all these reporting would be difficult, and 80% of the people said that yes, it is difficult. And this is because that we are feeling the fear of how these new terminologies and new things that is coming up, how it would translate into the financial reporting which we are used to. And I would give you the confidence that the way that we have been dealing with the changes in the IFRS within the last 2 decades or so, we have been taking on the new standards and implementing those, and this is something that is not that much different, and this is just another standard that we need to. Now the change, another change, and this is a beautiful change that we need to is the scope and the horizon of the entire reporting has been changed. Previously, we used to report about the entity which we are reporting for. For example, if I am reporting for XYZ company, I only report about XYZ information about XYZ company. But now with this S1 and S2 and all those sustainability standards which require us to report on our entire value chain. As Christopher also mentioned, and probably most of you are aware of that, it is required for us in the emission side and the GHG side that we report on scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And that scope 3 is basically the carbon emissions and climatical effects of our suppliers and vendors, our customers, and maybe in certain cases, post sales scenarios as well. For example, if I talk about a vehicle industry, a car manufacturer. So more and more we are seeing that the car manufacturers are moving from conventional cars to electronic cars. But only moving from conventional cars to EV does not mean that their ESG impact has been lowered or they are very good on their financial reporting. They still have to report on their scope 3 side. So not only how the carbon emissions of the battery manufacturer that is supposed to be placed on my vehicle, how they are performing, not only that, but also even if I have sold the car, the impact of those batteries and how those batteries after sale or after the end of their life would be disposed of, and what impact would that disposal of those batteries would have impact on the climate. So all those things, right from my vendors, how they what they are doing with respect to climate, till my customers, and maybe after sales, how those customers are disposing of those products which I produce. And the other important change which we were used to is the time horizon. We were used to report on the historical events of the company or of the organization we are reporting on to the date of the financial report, on the date of the end of the financial report of the period which we are reporting. But now it is talking about the future orientation of the business. As the onion reporting that Dr. Christopher showed us, that all those climatical risks that we would be looking for and would be identifying that our particular organization would be looking after, and those mitigating measures for those risks and probably all those opportunities that we see that are from those environmental conditions, all those have an impact on my business and my business strategy. That would translate into what business strategy my business strategy would be going forward. And whatever my business strategy would be going forward would have also an impact on my existing balance sheet, my assets and liabilities, and all those things which I'll touch on in a few minutes. And then obviously connecting all the dots, because one of the requirements that S1 and other standards we could come focusing on is the consistency of the financial reporting and the sustainability reporting. So if previously, if there were companies who were doing voluntarily disclosures of their sustainability targets or their commitment to net zeros or something else, which were independent of the financial reporting, but now this would not be the case. Now the sustainability reporting would be part and parcel of the financial reporting. So this would be one arena, one big report having financial reporting and the sustainability reporting. So whatever I report on the sustainability side should also have a similar impact on my financial reporting side as well. So the entire the historical impact, the future impact, my strategies, all these things now would be in a connected environment in one reporting, which has a sustainable reporting and the financial reporting. So all those natural capitals and human capital and social capital that Christopher talked about would all have impact on our financial reportings. This slide, which Christopher already told you that, for example, if I only talk about climate-related risk, there are two types of risk. Christopher already touched upon, so I need not to repeat those things. That are transitional risk and physical risk, and both would gonna have impact on my future business strategies. And all those impact which my future business strategies would have will now translate into the financial impact of, and then that means it will have an impact on my income statement, cash flows, balance sheet, not only obviously more of a future oriented impact, but those future oriented business impact would have a outlook or may have an effect on the date of my assets and liabilities on the date of my on the reporting date. So if we all know, there was one standard that we used to evaluate, which was IAS 10, where we were used to report on event that happened after the balance sheet date, but before the issuance of the financial statement. Those were the only small area that had a future-oriented impact on our financial reporting previously, but now this would be a greater impact on our assets and liabilities. So all those risks and opportunities would have an outcome, and those outcome would probably have a business impact, and that business impact would gonna have a financial impact, which could be a reduction in revenue or increase in revenue, asset impairments, increased cost, and all those things would gonna have an impact on our assets and liabilities. So just to quickly update what IASB doing at the moment, IASB has a project, the entire project, which is titled as climate related and other uncertainties in the financial statements. And what IASB is doing is they're creating illustrative examples that we're used to seeing as the part of our accounting standards. And they are making illustrative examples which would translate climate related and other uncertainties have an impact on our financial statements. And all those illustrative statements, examples would then become part of accounting standards. Currently, they have already developed, and they are in a phase where they are looking forward to publish a exposure draft with all those examples who gonna come out, and all the financial professionals out there in the world would be asked to give their comments, and probably there would be an opportunity of our learnings and what we have learned over the period of impact of ESG related issues on our IFRS reporting. Last year in July 2023, just after the S1 and S2 was issued by the ISSB, the ISB also issued a educational material where they also identified all those, not all, but quite a number of standards where they see that there would be an impact of climate related information and disclosures that has impact on accounting standards. So obviously there are all those participants would also be thinking one before I move forward a question that, hey, probably this is something which would not affect us really soon in Pakistan. So I leave the regulatory part for Asad to put highlights on that, how regulatory framework is moving here in Pakistan, because Asad is one of the people who's working closely with the regulators in Pakistan. So I'll let him to talk about on that. But even if the regulations are not there, or if the regulation, even if the regulation comes in, it comes for the state, for the banks or the large companies or listed companies. And if you think you're off, so no, I think Christopher already answered this, that you will still be part of the scope 3 emission calculation of those large entities, and you would anyways, as a business case, have to work on the ESG related data. As he also gave an example of a refrigeration company works for and the beverages multinational companies. So this education material had an also if I go standard by standard, so I've also kept written the relevant reference of the paragraph that would be affected by the sustainability reporting would be the paragraph that have an impact of sustainability reporting, and these slides can be shared with you after the session, so you can always go and refer to those comments. So I'll start with the IAS 1. So IAS 1, we all know, requires us to disclose about the estimates and judgments. And probably when you do the scenario analysis based on your climatic matrices and targets, and all those scenarios with business as usual or world with 2 degrees higher, or all those scenarios that a company is going to build, it will have a significant effect on your estimations of the current assets and liabilities, and your maybe going concern effect as well. And all those things would now have to be disclosed. So I have already seen financial statements of larger multinationals now giving us a accounting policy on climate change, and uh, and some are specifically saying climate-related impact as a policy, and some are saying a sustainability-related impact on our assets and liabilities. So all those assets and liabilities which are recorded as at the date would have an impact on our sustainability, from our sustainability outlook and the business models that have been changed due to those transitional and physical changes. For example, I remember one of the first of sessions that ICAP arranged on ESG. I remember the CFO for the Unilever talking about that they have already started making changes in their supply chain and then their business model. And certain cases, they have started changing the packing materials of the goods that they produce. So all those inventories of the previous packing materials will now have an NRV impact. So just because you're planning to change your packaging material in future, like for example, if I say for the beverage industry, maybe there might be a day we go and pass and the PET bottles are replaced again by the glass bottles that we used to have, or bottles that could be refillable again. So all those inventories that was there as at that date would have an NRV impact, because we might not know that inventories would be usable in future or not. And obviously, there are two types of impact on the entire standard that we talk about. One is the transitional effect, maybe due to regulations and laws and all those things which the countries would gonna build now and are already building. I was just seeing that there are more than 27 countries already who are now imposing, or at least planning to impose, carbon-related taxations. I know we really do not like to hear about more taxes these days, at least after the finance bill that come out. But this is something reality that the world is moving towards, and all those regulations because of the Paris Accord that would gonna come to make this world a livable place or maintain the temperatures. So that would have an impact on our accounting standards as well. So income taxes is fairly simple. I would not take much time. All those deferred taxes that we have reported as at a particular reporting date, we need to assess again that we have a significant revenues or profits in future that these assets could be utilized in future or not, because maybe a climate impact would have an entire a physical climate impact would have an impact on the entire business model of yours. For example, all those cigarette industries are now moving towards a tobacco-less or a different kind of smoking material or nicotine material. So there is shift into the business dynamics and once and for all. So all those business models that changes would then also have an impact on our property, plant, and equipment if I talk about IS 16. So the economic useful life would gonna probably might change of a particular plant if a regulation comes in and requires us to replace a particular machinery much more sooner than we were expecting. Or probably we see a regulation coming out that we need to uh, replace the vehicles for after a certain period of time, and so that the carbon emissions that our vehicles produce have a lesser impact due to the age of our vehicle. Similarly, I would talk about IS 36. I think this is one of the assets, one of the standard book which have a major impact on how we see things or how we report things on the sustainability standard and how our future outlook and how our future business model would gonna look like and how the entire value chain would gonna look like. So not only our assets would uh, may have an indication of impairment just because our future business model is changing or we are about to adopt a new technology or due to or forcefully due to because of any legislations coming out or maybe due to a physical risk we are looking for new dimensions of business models which would have an impact on our CGU calculations. So not only there would be an impact of on the indication of as a impairment of the asset, but all our calculations for valuing use and all the cash flow projections that we're gonna make would now have an impact based on our business strategies, which we see for future, owing to the mitigating measures of the climatic change or other sustainability related changes that we are seeing. So if our business model changes, the cash flow projections for the next 5 years or so, or whatever what the requirement is, maybe that also changes just because we are changing the technology. And maybe as we are now talking more and more about understanding more and more about green financing, maybe the rate of financing also changes, and that rate of financing would then also have an impact on our discount rates. So not only the value, the calculation of value used may change because due to the change in the discount rate. So not only the cash flows is going to have an impact, but maybe due to the financing arrangement or the conventional financing may get more expensive and might have an impact on our discount rates in there. And moving along, I would quickly move on to IFRS 9, as IFRS 9 is not fully, at least not fully implemented in our financial sector. But one of the impact that IFRS 9 would gonna have would be on the ECL calculation because borrowers might get may default due to change in the business scenarios, and probably the ECL calculation might have to change, or maybe the lenders would have to renegotiate the terms of the loans, and then might have an impact on how they recognize their financial instruments, or even if I say the fair value measurement also gonna have an impact. If I go back to the example that Christopher shared us with the satellite pictures of the piece of property near the sea, year by year or decade by decade, that the value of that property has it's changed. And one of the factors where we apply IFRS 13 is how the market sees the fair value and who is what the fair value is and not how I see as the financial controller the fair value. So if the market sees a change in the physical risk or physical climate has an impact on the valuation of a property or of an asset, then probably when I apply IFRS 13 and when I do a fair value measurement of my assets, I have to take in account for all those physical and transitional risks. One thing I probably missed is I'll quickly touch upon on IAS 37, the provisions and the contingent liabilities, because there would be an impact over here as well. Because if you remember, IAS 37 also talks about constructive liability. So even if there are no regulations out there, even if there are no IFRS S1 and S2 out there, or even I have not required to apply S2, but if the company has made a constructive obligation on them by announcing their net zero plan, which most of the multinational companies are doing irrespective of the regulations coming in, then I have already made a constructive obligation on my organization, and those net zero plans in my future climatic outlook now might write certain constructive obligations and liabilities on my side. And obviously, new regulations might attract new provisions as well, new ways to do things. As there's a law out there in EU about how the electrical and electronic waste material would be disposed of. So probably that might also attract certain new liabilities. Onerous contract would be probably one of the areas that also would have gonna have an impact, because maybe due to physical climatic conditions, certain cost of certain raw materials go drastically high, and maybe I end up going into certain onerous contracts. So probably those provisions might also have to look after. I would, with respect to contingent liability, I would like to share a very good example that there might be legal obligation coming in. So Shell had a legal case against them where they were brought in by certain uh, civil societies that about their impact on the water levels and environment and all those things. While pleading that case by the Shell in the Netherlands, the court did agree that Shell was not doing anything unlawful as of that date, but then court also directed them and gave them certain targets with respect to their emissions for the future. So they ended up having certain contingent liabilities on the financial statements, because even though they were really hopeful that they might not, the future outcome of these already court orders which they challenged would be in their favor, but they still were not pretty sure, and they had certain contingent liabilities on their future statements. I think I have 5 more minutes, and I would like to just put one last thing, which is the future of which we are looking for. That all those companies who would be going on their net zero journey would not be able to neutralize their carbon emissions internally. They might be going out and buying certain carbon credits from the organizations or from the institution who are carbon positive. And those carbon credits and renewable energy certificates and all those things that are now coming in raises a question that how should those carbon credits be recognized in the financial statements? And at the moment, we do not have any clear financial standard which can say, hey, this could be the way you're gonna recognize the carbon credits. So I think that we do not have an option for poll here. So if we had, I would have asked the question, will it be an inventory? Will it be an intangible asset? Or will it be a financial instrument according to IFRS 9? So the answer is probably it would depend on how you would using these carbon credits. If you are a broker and you're into business of buying and selling carbon credits, then probably that would be an inventory for you. But if you're a user of those carbon credits and you basically bought it for for neutralizing your carbon emissions, and this is according to your business model and your climatic outlook, then probably that is an intangible asset that would sit on your balance sheet, and that might have also might be required to have an impairment assessment on every reporting date. And maybe you might purchase a carbon credit not only to neutralize your carbon emission, but also as an investment from an investment point of view. And probably then you might have to record it as a financial instrument as financial security according to the IFRS 9. So these are still a topic that the financial professionals are debating on, and how these carbon credits and all those things which would now be being developed, would how this would be recognized, and owing to the fact that at the moment the marketable the markets or the platforms where you can trade these carbon credits are not that functional at the moment. The valuation of those carbon credits would also be a challenge for the controllers. I think that would be pretty much it from my side. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I'll give it back to Manahil and Asad to take this forward.
Thank you so much, Danish, for such a wonderful presentation and insights. So I would hand over the session to Asad Firoz. And if there is any query I would like to ask participant, please raise your hand. Okay, I have a query from a participant that is addressed to Dr. Christopher. So if I allowed, may I ask to you?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
All right. Christopher, he is asking for your views on the best report which you have encountered, and would you advise board to have a dedicated committee on ESG or sustainability or not?
All right. Let me try and answer the second one first, and then I'll say.
Okay.
So one of the things that you want to avoid with good governance is an explosion of subcommittees of the board. You know, it's the issue with the board is to make sure that the subcommittees support the board in terms of good decision making. And when you analyze ESG, you'll see that all the disclosures constantly referring to risk and opportunity, risk and opportunity. So my question maybe to answer the question is, where does the responsibility, which subcommittee of the board does take responsibility primarily for risk? And that would differ from organization to organization. Sometimes you've got an audit and risk committee. Sometimes you've got a risk committee. Others you've got a risk and ethics committee. And, so organizations differ. So it could be that you specifically consider a risk committee that has the environmental issues. In a South African context, it's a bit even more interesting because we have legislation that requires social and ethics committees if there's a public interest score that's high enough. So really the social and the ethics component is adopted in another committee. And in other words, you would then take the risk component in the risk committee. So unfortunately, there's no easy answer. But to me, the risk component has to be integrated with your risk process, and therefore that component should be wherever you as a subcommittee deal with risk. As far as the reporting is concerned, once again, it depends on what are you reporting on. Do you want to report on GRI, IFRS? So when it comes to what is a good report, it depends on what framework you're applying. I do quite a bit of evaluation of integrated reporting, and to me, I would rather say that a good report is one that provides the disclosures, but that's readable. That actually has a decent flow, and that's why I spent a little bit of emphasis on the end to say we need to make sure we have got proper integrated reporting, and the integrated framework provides the skeleton, the basis on which to build that reporting framework. So difficult question to answer, because once again, are we reporting on CDP, GRI, TCG? It depends. But the principle remains, what makes a good report? A good report is one that has proper disclosures, but is written in such a way that it's logical flow, makes sense, that it's not a dumping of information.
So if I may add to what Dr. Christopher said, and probably Dr. Christopher correct me if I'm wrong. I think the effect of industries will also be relevant when you talk about good report, because industry to industry reports are going to differ. The industry you are in, you're reporting a different sets of matrices and targets, and probably another industry might have all together a different set of matrices and targets, might not be comparable to the other industry. So, and this is what has been a conventional way of evaluating the reports as well. And Asad can correct me, even if our normal reporting channel, we get rate them for the best corporate report. We do it by sector, industry sector wise. And this is is the reason, because every industry works in a different environment and they have different set of disclosures and requirements to report on. And that is why if you're looking for a good sustainability report, you also have to look into the similar industry where you're working in.
All right. Thank you so much, Christopher and Danish Noorani Saab, for your answers. So I would like to invite Mr. Asad Feroz for the closing remarks. So Asad Saab, hand it over to you.
Thank you, Minahil. I would be speaking in a minute. I think there was a question from Mr. Malik Mirza. He wanted to ask something. If he's still online, if you can ask him to unmute, he wants to ask something to Dr. Christopher, I think.
Yes,
Can
the
we please
question
check?
I raised was asked by Mr. Malik Mirza, but he is not here.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. Thank you very much, Manahil, for this introduction. Yes, at CPD committee, we are very thankful, and I would also like to thank on behalf of the Northern Regional Committee, and I would like to thank the Northern Regional Committee team members who actually initially took this initiative and planned it with Dr. Christopher and Mr. Danish. And because of that initiative, Dr. Christopher was amongst us today. And I'm very sure that all of you must have learned a lot in this session. And as far as sustainability is concerned, we have done a lot of work in Pakistan on sustainability. We are actually one of the key players as far as just sustainability is concerned in Pakistan. We have been an active member of SCCP's Regulator Security and Exchange Commission of Pakistan, the roadmap that we have. Firstly, we have developed a sustainability working group at ICAP in Accounting Standards Board, where we are looking at different aspects of sustainability, and especially after the release by ISSB S1, S2, the standards, when and for which organizations these standards would be implemented. We are working on that aspect as well. And we are actively rolled out different sort of initiatives. We had a awareness session in Karachi, Islamabad, and Lahore regarding sustainability. Then recently we had master classes in Karachi, Islamabad, and Lahore on S1 and S2. Then our president, Mr. Farooq Rahman, spoke in Singapore on sustainability. He was nominated by IFAC. He also spoke in IFAC's PAO DAG subgroup as well, and he gave a detailed overview of sustainability. He also wrote an article that was published by IFAC regarding the whole implementation of sustainability, S1 and S2 in Pakistan, and the efforts that were being made by the institute along with Security and Exchange Commission of Pakistan. So we also had one of our directors. He spoke on sustainability in one of the IFRS seminars, and then we had a huge sort of a dialogue where we had different panelists from UNDP, Asian Development Bank, ISSSB, and SECP, and all of these stakeholders discussed different impacts of sustainability reporting in Pakistan and how this is going to impact us as individuals, as consultants, as practicing chartered accountants, and also how it is going to impact the industry as well. Then I'm also part of Sustainability Hub. It's a Chartered Accountants Worldwide Sustainability Group. It is basically a group that has been created for the sake of awareness and for implementation of sustainability across the different chartered accountant institutes who are part of Chartered Accountants Worldwide. So what they have done is Chartered Accountants Worldwide has created a sustainability hub. If you Google that sustainability hub, so it is a huge array of knowledge that is there regarding carbon footprint, the net zero objectives, and different articles that are related to governance of ESG. There is different articles that are related to SMEs, and so many other articles that are there on Sustainability Knowledge Hub of CAW. And I think there is a lot of work that is done by them. And I can also intimate you with a lot of pride that first webinar on sustainability by Chartered Accountants Worldwide will be held sometime in October this year, along with the association of our institute, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan. So there is a lot being done as far as sustainability is concerned. We at institute level are trying our best to increase the awareness level regarding the impacts of sustainability, especially the reporting requirements of S1 and S2, and the phased approach that we have recommended to the SECP, and they have kindly accepted it, and they have given us that role as well, that whenever a sustainability standard comes in, ICAP will review it and recommend to SECP as is done with international financial reporting standards. So this journey is a tough journey where learning is required, skill set has to be enhanced, and from both the industry side, they have to be prepared, and from even the consulting or from the audit firm's perspective who would be doing the sustainability assurance, now that the sustainability assurance standards have also been released. So now things are, I think, taking a shape. And with this shape coming in, I think there is more need to be prepared for this and to have the knowledge and the skill set and to have basically the expertise level sort of thinking that how this S1 and S2 standards will be actually applied by the organizations. We are also holding the BCR awards with Institute of Chartered Management Accountants of Pakistan for last 24 years. And we actually honor the company who is performing according to the criteria of best sustainability report that have experts have developed. So again, we are also championing in that forefront, and we are trying to also improve the criteria there. And in the coming years, inshallah, we will be judging the companies, the corporate entities in Pakistan in accordance with S1 and S2 as well, depending upon a criteria that would be developed by our BCR committee. So with these words, I would again like to thank Dr. Christopher for taking time out for this webinar, the Mr. Danish Noorani for sparing time for this event. And I think it has been a good learning curve for all of you. As always, from CPD Central Committee, we will keep on bringing you new programs, new endeavors, and sustainability, rest assured, will be in our radar, inshallah, in months ahead. And we will continue to provide you with some quality programs in future as well. So thank you very much. Over to Manahil.
Thank you so much, Asad Saab, Dr. Christopher, and Danish Noorani for such an amazing session. So, we will conclude our webinar on developing ESG landscape strategies for sustainable success. Thank you, everyone, for your participation, and looking forward to see you at future events. Allah Hafiz. Thank you so much.